10 millennia ago, the far north of Norway lay quiet under a harsh sky. Beyond the Arctic Circle, a narrow ribbon of newly livable coast opened between lingering ice and the cold sea. Into that emptiness came a small group of seafarers moving along the shoreline in light boats stretched with hides. They hauled their gear onto a beach, raised shelter, and began the routine of a temporary home. The ocean here offered a rare kind of generosity. Fish, seals, seabirds, and sheltered waters that could sustain people who knew how to travel fast and live with little. At Sletnes, in Finnmark, traces left behind by one such camp still mark the moment when humans pushed into one of Europe's last remote frontiers. Those first arrivals did not stay only at the water's edge. Within a few generations, their descendants began to range inland, following rivers and valleys that led toward higher ground, where glaciers still clung to the landscape. Up there, reindeer moved in great seasonal herds, and the hunters learned how to meet them on their routes, taking advantage of narrow passes and natural bottlenecks. The shift mattered. It meant these coastal specialists were not trapped by the sea. They could live as maritime hunters and still exploit the interior when conditions allowed. What stands out is the speed of this northward expansion. Starting far to the south, among the islands off western Sweden, these mobile groups spread along the coast, crossed the southern reaches of Norway, and then pressed steadily north along the long Atlantic shoreline. In only a few centuries, they occupied an enormous zone. They did not creep forward in small steps, settling every bay in order. Instead, they skipped past stretches where ice still choked the coast or where landing places were poor. And they established themselves in areas that had already been ice-free for thousands of years. Slettenes appears to have been near the end of that long push. The sea route from the region of modern Göteborg to the far north measures more than 2,000 kilometres, an extraordinary distance for small bands moving without towns, roads, or fixed supply lines. Yet the pattern suggests confidence at sea, knowledge of coastal resources, and a willingness to gamble on the next headland. To understand how such a journey became possible, it helps to widen the view. Humans had reached Europe more than 1 million years earlier, but the deeper past is mostly visible in the south. The first people in the northern half of the continent remain shadows, partly because evidence is rare and partly because ice, cold, and shifting landscapes erased much of what once existed. There are faint and disputed hints of very early visits to the far north, perhaps during warmer intervals between glacial peaks. But if those visits happened, they did not last. When the climate turned brutal again, any small populations would have withdrawn or died out. The first clear and widely accepted signs of humans returning to northern Europe belong to the late stages of the last ice age, roughly 13,000 years before the present era. By then, changes further south had already set the stage. During the coldest phase of the last glaciation, much of Europe may have been nearly empty of people. The environment was simply too severe across wide regions, with sparse food, deep cold, and unstable conditions. Human groups appear to have survived in scattered pockets, where shelter and resources were reliable, in parts of southwestern France, along the Cantabrian coast of Spain, and in major river valleys far to the east. These pockets acted as refuges. Outside them, the archaeological record thins dramatically, especially across the broad plain that stretches toward the north. As temperatures began to rise again, those southern refuges became sources of expansion. People, ideas, and technologies moved outward into landscapes that were slowly becoming habitable. Late in the Ice Age, different hunting traditions were established across Europe. In the west, groups in the Franco-Cantabrian region left behind famous cave paintings and portable art, along with deep deposits showing repeated use of favoured places. Their diets leaned heavily on reindeer, with horses also playing a major role. Further east, mammoth hunting contributed more to survival, and the material record reflects different conditions and different opportunities. As the climate warmed, some of the Western traditions appear to have pushed northward. Tool styles and manufacturing habits link the earliest reliable occupants of northwestern Europe to that western source region. The spread can be traced through sites across the Paris Basin, the Meuse Basin, the southern Netherlands, the Rhine Valley, and into parts of central Germany, then onward toward the uplands of Poland and Moravia. In a few locations, artifact sets look like stepping stones between older Western traditions and the earliest toolkits, later seen in southern Scandinavia. These transitional places hint at contact, movement, and gradual change rather than a single abrupt replacement. All of this happened while climate was shifting fast enough to reshape coastlines and redraw maps within human lifetimes. The final millennia of the last ice age were not a smooth slide toward warmth. Instead, the Earth lurched between milder and harsher intervals. Ice sheets melted back, sea levels rose, and new seas formed where dry land had been. Vast lowlands that once connected regions were drowned, creating islands and straits. Meanwhile, vegetation changed, transforming open tundra into patchy woodland as warmth increased, then stalling or reversing when cold snapped back. The end of the Ice Age is often divided into phases based on these oscillations, because those swings directly affected where people could live and what they could hunt. In the far north, the boundary between the last Ice Age and the recent warm era is set around the late 10th millennium before the present era, when the climate stabilized enough to mark the start of a new world. As the landscape shifted, so did human toolkits. Archaeologists recognize several distinct traditions in the late Ice Age of Northern Europe, largely identified through the shape and style of stone projectile points. These were not minor decorative differences. Point design reflects how a weapon is used, how it is hafted, whether hunters favor spears or arrows, and how they organize a hunt. In southern Scandinavia, the final phases of the Ice Age are represented mainly in Denmark and the far south of Sweden. Most sites are small, and organic material rarely survives, so stone tools carry much of the story. Some traditions are defined by carefully made blades and distinctive points that suggest specialized hunting methods. Others show a move toward different weapon designs, perhaps responding to changes in prey, environment, or social networks. One early tradition is known for producing long blades with great skill and efficiency. Toolmakers selected good flint and shaped it with careful planning, turning cores into standardized blanks that could become points, scrapers, and burins. Among the more distinctive tools were narrow, beak-like scrapers used to work antler, and certain point forms that stand out immediately in a collection. In the low, boggy tunnel valleys north of Hamburg, conditions were unusually favourable for preservation. In those wet sediments, excavations exposed not only stone but also wood, bone, and antler, creating a rare window into late Ice Age life. At one site near a small ancient lake, two separate occupations lay buried at different depths. The deeper deposits belonged to an earlier hunting episode. Higher layers represented a later return, centuries afterward. Both phases left behind many stone tools and large numbers of animal bones. Antler and bone objects showed how hunters turned the bodies of reindeer into equipment. Heavy-duty tools, clubs, and points with barbs designed to bite into flesh. In the later layer, something even more striking appeared. Dozens upon dozens of wooden arrow shafts, some shaped to a simple point, others prepared to hold small stone tips. A few shafts still contained the broken bases of stone points, likely snapped on impact during a hunt. The presence of these arrows suggests a developed bow and arrow technology by that later time, even if no complete bow survived. In the earlier phase, despite excellent preservation, no arrow shafts turned up, leaving open the question of whether hunters relied more on spears, throwing weapons, or arrows whose wooden parts simply did not end up in the preserved deposits. The animal bones from this wetland site speak loudly. Reindeer dominated the assemblage to an overwhelming degree, forming the backbone of survival. The later occupation alone represented more than 1,000 individual animals, while other species appeared only rarely. A handful of foxes, hares, or other mammals may reflect opportunistic hunting or fur use, and some bones might belong to later intrusions because wet places often attract animals and humans across many periods. Still, the main pattern is clear. These people were expert reindeer hunters. Even the way reindeer were killed can be reconstructed. Some evidence suggests animals were shot while in water, perhaps swimming across the lake. The placement of wounds in certain bones implies hits from above, consistent with hunters shooting from a boat or a platform near the shore. Reindeer droppings preserved in the sediments point to animals spending time in the water, reinforcing the idea that the lake itself became part of the hunting strategy. A watery killing ground would have helped slow the herd and limit escape, making it easier for a small group to take multiple animals efficiently. Seasonality can also be teased out. By studying tooth growth and wear in reindeer jaws, researchers have inferred that many kills happened in the autumn, when animals were fat and conditions favoured preserving meat. If most hunting was concentrated in fall, then winter survival likely depended on stored food: dried meat, marrow, and fat rendered from bones. It is possible that during other seasons these groups moved elsewhere, perhaps toward ancient coastlines that are now submerged under the North Sea. At that time, lower sea levels exposed broad plains and shores that no longer exist above water, meaning part of the annual cycle may be hidden beyond reach. Some of the most puzzling finds from the lake were whole reindeer skeletons resting intact on the bottom, seemingly weighted down with stones. Early interpretations imagined ritual offerings, but a more practical explanation fits the needs of hunters living in a cold world. Submerging carcasses in near-freezing water would slow decay and protect meat from scavengers, functioning as a kind of natural storage. In a landscape where ice and permafrost were common, cold itself could be used as a tool. Reindeer provided nearly everything such groups needed. Meat supplied calories, marrow and fat offered critical energy, and even the contents of the stomach could contribute nutrients in lean times. Hides became clothing and shelter and could be sewn into boat skins. Antler, strong and workable, was shaped into points, handles, and specialized tools. One method involved carving deep parallel grooves into softened antler and prying out long splinters that could be turned into barbed tips. Such points left distinctive wounds that have been identified on reindeer shoulder blades, showing they were not merely made but used. The location of sites fits the behavior of both hunters and prey. Late Ice Age camps in northern Europe are often found inland along riverbanks and lakeshores, places that intersected migration routes. Hunters favoured elevated ground with wide views across open tundra, choosing promontories, ridges, and islands where they could spot herds from afar. Some places were natural funnels where animals were forced to pass. Others offered strategic control over crossings or narrow valleys. The scarcity of caves and the rarity of deep, layered deposits mean most of what survives comes from open-air settings that were later disturbed by frost movement, soil creep, and eventually agriculture. That is why preserved wetland sites stand out so sharply. They keep what the rest of the landscape lost. Across Denmark and southern Scandinavia, similar patterns appear in other camps, Some are modest scatters of stone tools, likely short-term hunting stops. Others contain denser concentrations suggesting a longer stay, perhaps a small family group living in a tent-like shelter. At a few sites, the distribution of stones and tools hints at the outline of a dwelling, with a central hearth marked by burned flint. These traces are faint but repeated enough to suggest a consistent way of organising camp life. A focused, living space, an area for tool making, and a surrounding scatter of debris. Over time, tool styles shifted. One later tradition is marked by small, curved, backed pieces that likely served as parts of arrow tips, suggesting the bow played a larger role. The workmanship in these assemblages can vary, with less emphasis on long standardized blades and more on flexible use of flakes and irregular blanks. This may reflect changes in raw material strategies, hunting needs, or social connections across wide territories. These backed pieces appear across a broad swathe of northern and central Europe, from France and Belgium through Germany, and into Scandinavia, showing that ideas and techniques travelled far even in a sparsely populated world. Another tradition, recognised by large, robust points, with pronounced tangs, suggests a different approach. The heavy form of these points and the absence of many small arrow components have been taken to indicate that spear-like weapons may have remained important, perhaps alongside simpler projectile systems. Flint working in these assemblages can look more straightforward and less meticulous, especially in regions where high-quality stone was plentiful. Some sites of this tradition appear small and task-focused, rich in points but poor in manufacturing debris, consistent with brief hunting visits. Others are larger, with more waste flakes and a higher proportion of scrapers and burins, suggesting more time spent processing hides, shaping wood or antler, and maintaining equipment at a residential camp. As the climate swung again into a sharp cold phase near the end of the Ice Age, yet another hunting tradition spread across the North European plain and into southern Scandinavia. Its diagnostic points were smaller and lighter, designed to be hafted securely. In the rare wetland contexts where wood survived, these points were found still attached to arrow shafts, turning a guess into something close to certainty. Sites from this period are often tiny and lightly scattered, which fits the image of highly mobile reindeer hunters moving through a cold, open landscape. Even so, occasional finds in western Sweden hint that people were already adapting quickly, reaching northward whenever coastlines and vegetation allowed. While southern Scandinavia's earliest post-Ice Age story is told mainly through inland hunting cultures that walked in from the south, the central and northern parts of the region followed a different path. Here, the first major wave appears to have arrived by sea. These were maritime people, tuned to coastal resources, comfortable travelling along shorelines and capable of leapfrogging vast distances. They could exploit inland reindeer soon after arriving, but the sea remained central to their way of life. Along the Swedish and Norwegian coasts, closely related groups spread with remarkable speed, filling the newly available coastline from the western edge of Sweden up to the far northern fjords in what may have been only a few centuries. Their movement was not a slow diffusion into every corner. It was a targeted colonization of the best landing places and resource zones, stitched together by travel over water. In this world of fast-changing climate, the archaeological record likely reflects repeated cycles of leaving and returning. When temperatures fell and environments deteriorated, people may have retreated south or toward more stable coasts. When warmth returned, the same corridors opened again and new groups moved in, sometimes carrying related traditions, sometimes bringing different ones. The shifts in toolkits, the overlaps in dates where they can be obtained, and the patchy distribution of sites all fit a landscape where opportunity appeared and disappeared, It is easy to imagine how quickly a small population could fragment, relocate, or vanish when ice advanced, seas rose, or prey routes shifted. Even with the richest sites, the picture remains incomplete. Many settlements from this time left no charcoal, no preserved bone, and no stratified layers, only a thin scatter of stone on a wind-swept rise. Thousands of years of frost churn and later farming blurred the edges of camps, mixing debris and flattening the traces of structures. The few places where wetlands protected wood, antler, and bone become crucial because they allow a fuller reconstruction of how hunting worked, how tools were made and used, and how people organised their lives around the movements of animals. The lakes and narrow valleys of southern Scandinavia still hold faint memories of the last reindeer hunters. One such place lies at the end of a long water-filled corridor, a setting strikingly similar to the well-known hunting grounds farther south in Germany. Migrating herds would have moved naturally along the valley floor and been forced to cross the lake at its narrowest point. Hunters, positioned on the banks, or waiting in light boats, could have taken animals with arrows before they reached deep water. Although the soil has yielded no bone or wood to confirm the details, traces of charcoal suggest people were present here around the 9th millennium, before the present era. The stone tools left behind show that the place was used in more than one age, first by late reindeer hunters, and later by the earliest communities of the new Mesolithic world. Farther east in Skåne, another site offers rare biological clues. At Hesselberga, fragments of animal bone survived long enough to tell a richer story. The remains span the final warm phase of the Ice Age and the abrupt return to cold that followed. Most of the dated reindeer bones belong to the latter part of that cold interval, and one skull even falls just inside the beginning of the warmer period that came after. Among the stone artifacts are types associated with two different hunting traditions, showing that the same ground was revisited across generations. The animal list is varied: freshwater fish, birds, mountain hare, Arctic fox, wild horse, and large numbers of reindeer. Such diversity suggests that people here were not bound to a single prey, but adjusted their strategies as opportunities shifted. As the ice loosened its grip on western Sweden and the Oslo Fjord region, a new cultural expression emerged along the coast. This tradition, known today as Hensbacka, represents the first clear human presence in those maritime landscapes. It began at the end of the final cold snap and continued into the earliest centuries of the new warm age. Its stone tools closely resemble those of the late reindeer hunters, farther south, indicating a shared heritage. Yet the settlement pattern is different. Sites cluster on raised beaches and islands, revealing a people oriented toward the sea. The geography of that time explains much. In the centuries when these groups arrived, southern Scandinavia was separated from the rest of the continent by broad waters linking the North Sea with the Baltic. Western Sweden consisted of chains of islands, rather than continuous land, and the interior of Norway was still sealed beneath glacial ice. Anyone reaching the Norwegian coast before 10,000 years ago had to come by boat. The nearest mainland lay more than 100 kilometers away across open water. Such conditions favoured communities skilled in seafaring and in the exploitation of marine resources. Hundreds of early coastal sites have been recorded in this region. Their locations show a clear preference for straits, headlands, and outer archipelagos, where seals, fish, and seabirds were plentiful. In later generations, camps spread more evenly from the outer islands toward the interior, hinting at a gradual broadening of economic life. Unlike the western shore, the east coast of Sweden lacks comparable early sites, emphasizing how decisive the rich waters of the Kattegat and North Sea were in shaping human movement. The stone toolkit of these coastal pioneers carries its own signature. Distinctive tanged points appear alongside large flake axes, tools made from single broad flakes with one face left untouched. These implements may have served as adzes or heavy knives for cutting meat and hide. Small microliths and microburins foreshadow the technologies that would dominate the Mesolithic centuries. Because true flint sources were scarce outside southern Scandinavia, people relied on two solutions: prepared cores brought north from better quarries and nodules dropped along the beaches by melting icebergs. This drift flint, though limited in size, became a crucial raw material. Where even that was insufficient, communities turned to quartzite, chert, jasper, and crystal, adapting their methods to whatever stone the landscape provided. One revealing camp lay on what was once a small island near the mouth of the Oslo fjord. When the ice still stood only a few days' walk to the north, a handful of people lit fires here and repaired their equipment. Modern analysis of the scattered flakes showed that many pieces could be refitted, proving that the occupation was brief and undisturbed. Two working areas contained the debris of blade production, while a third zone held finished tools, perhaps the place where animals were processed. Broken projectile points suggested recent hunts. Everything about the site points to a short stop by a very small group, perhaps a family arriving by boat, preparing for another journey. Another inland site, situated on the shore of a Swedish lake far from the sea, reveals how quickly these maritime people learned to exploit new environments. Here, around 8,700 years ago, hunters fished through the winter ice and pursued elk, aurochs, and beaver. Pike and perch bones were abundant, and the season of capture could be read from their growth rings. The absence of autumn plant foods implies that the camp was used mainly in the cold months. Several dogs, carefully buried with red ochre, show that human-animal partnerships were already deep and meaningful. The scatter of huts suggests a small community, perhaps a few related families enduring the dark northern winter together. Along the long coast of Norway, a closely related tradition flourished under the name Fosna. For decades, scholars assumed that the Norwegian shoreline had been uninhabitable until late in prehistory, yet new geological studies revealed that parts of it were free of ice thousands of years earlier. The absence of sites before the middle of the 10th millennium likely reflects the time required for boats and maritime skills to develop, rather than a lack of habitable land. Once that threshold was crossed, settlement spread with remarkable speed from south to north. Most Fosna camps lie on former islands facing the open ocean. Their toolkits mirror those of western Sweden: flake and core axes, tanged points, burins, and robust blades. A few highland sites show that reindeer hunting in the mountains soon complemented life by the sea. The pattern suggests communities that moved seasonally between coasts and uplands, following seals in one season and herds in another. At Gulta, on an island in southwestern Norway, traces of a vast early settlement were uncovered within ancient beach layers. The area may have covered 1,000 square meters and yielded an astonishing number of projectile points. Such richness implies repeated visits over many years, perhaps by generations of the same lineage. The artifacts are so similar to those from Sweden and Germany that their shared ancestry is unmistakable, tying this remote island to a wider northern world. Even more dramatic evidence emerged when modern industry opened a gas terminal on the island of Gossen. Archaeologists were given a rare chance to explore the ground before construction. Beneath the turf, they uncovered 17 stone rings, weights that had once held down the edges of tents. Around them lay more than 70,000 pieces of worked stone. Each ring was small and uniform, suggesting shelters for only a few people. Rather than a single large village, the site appears to record many brief occupations, perhaps by boat crews returning year after year to the same sheltered harbour. Though no boats survived, the logic of the setting leaves little doubt that travel by water was the key to this mobile life. Far to the north, inside the Arctic Circle, another tradition known as Komsa marks the first steps of humanity into the polar zone. For many years, these regions were left blank on maps of the Stone Age, assumed to have been frozen deserts. Yet the coast of Finnmark was free of ice surprisingly early, and people arrived there soon after 9,000 years ago. The earliest camps cluster beside narrow straits, where currents concentrate fish and marine mammals. Their stone tools, made largely from quartzite and local cherts, echo those of the southern coast, confirming a western origin rather than a migration from the east. One of the earliest Komsa settlements lies on the Sletens Peninsula, a wind-swept finger of land facing the Barents Sea. Excavations revealed clusters of blades and tanged points around patches of ash, the faint ghosts of shelters that once stood there. Nothing organic survived, yet the setting alone tells a story of seal hunters watching the channels where animals surfaced. A second site nearby, 1,000 years younger, contained a small hearth, ringed by stones and a few ground slate tools, showing that techniques were already diversifying. Although most Komsa sites hug the coast, occasional camps reached far inland. At Dumpokjaurache in northern Sweden, hunters paused beside a small lake around 7,800 years ago. They cooked fish and birds over 2 hearths and left behind a slate knife and a whetstone. The use of slate links them to communities farther east, demonstrating that even in these remote zones, ideas flowed across great distances. The artistic legacy of these early northern peoples is modest, but evocative. At Stellmore in Germany, a reindeer rib was found covered with enigmatic lines, perhaps a tally or a rhythm instrument. Another antler rod from Poggenvish bears intricate carving whose purpose is unknown. Most striking is an amber elk head discovered in the Elbe Valley, once attached to a staff and carved with surprising realism. In northern Norway, rock engravings of reindeer, elk, bears, and even killer whales were created around 8,000 years ago, the earliest known art of the region. These rare objects hint at symbolic worlds that otherwise left little trace. Looking across the whole span of the late Ice Age, a pattern emerges of pulses and retreats. As temperatures rose, hunters moved north into fresh grasslands and along newborn coasts. When cold returned, some regions were abandoned and others were recolonized by different groups carrying new styles of weapons. The earliest tradition reached only lightly into Scandinavia, but later communities occupied Denmark and southern Sweden more fully, adapting to a slightly wooded landscape and a broader range of prey. With the final cold phase, reindeer specialists again dominated, and their descendants soon learned to live from the sea as well as the tundra. The speed of expansion is one of the most remarkable features. Within only a few centuries after the ice withdrew, humans had settled nearly the entire Scandinavian coastline. Such rapid movement mirrors what happens when any species enters an empty environment, rich in resources and lacking strong competitors. Small family groups, travelling by boat and guided by curiosity, could leap from island to island and fjord to fjord, filling the map far faster than on foot. Yet much of their world now lies hidden. During the coldest period, the sea stood more than 100 meters lower than today. Any coastal camps from those times are buried deep beneath modern waters. What survives on land may represent only the inland half of a far richer economy. The strong maritime focus of the later Scandinavian sites suggests that even the earlier hunters might have depended heavily on coasts now lost to the sea. The stone industries themselves reveal little linear evolution. Different traditions appear and disappear, overlapping in time rather than forming a neat sequence. Settlement types range from tiny hunting stands to larger residential camps, but all reflect short stays by highly mobile people. Thick layers of occupation are absent, and not a single human skeleton has been recovered from these centuries. The pioneers left few permanent marks. By the opening of the Holocene, the world they knew was vanishing. Forests spread across the former tundra, and the great reindeer herds retreated northward. New animals, elk, deer, wild boar, became the main game, and the tools and habits of life changed accordingly. The last hunters of the Ice Age gave way to the communities of the Mesolithic. Yet their achievements remained foundational. They had crossed empty seas, read unfamiliar landscapes, and proved that even the edge of the Arctic could become a human home. Late in the autumn of a distant age, more than 8,000 years before the present, a massive wild bull staggered from the forest into the edge of a Danish lake. The aurochs was an imposing creature, taller than a man at the shoulder and heavy as a small cart. Yet this one was close to death. Arrows bristled from his flanks, most of them lodged in the rear where hunters had struck as he fled. Seeking relief from pain and pursuit, the animal waded into the cold water. There, far from the reach of his attackers, his strength finally failed. The body slipped beneath the surface and settled into the mud, taking with it the stone-tipped arrows that had ended his life. For millennia, the remains lay hidden until modern workers uncovered them by chance. A silent witness to a hunt that had unfolded on a long-vanished shoreline. Stories like this invite questions about the people who lived in Northern Europe before farming transformed the continent. It is easy to imagine that their lives must have been harsh and precarious, dependent on uncertain hunting and gathering. Yet the growing body of evidence from the early post-glacial centuries suggests a different picture. These communities were adaptable and inventive, and many appear to have lived in environments rich with opportunity. The period between the end of the Ice Age and the arrival of agriculture, often called the Middle Stone Age, was not a brief interlude but a long chapter in its own right, stretching for thousands of years. During this time, the landscape of Scandinavia changed beyond recognition. Forests replaced the open tundra, and new species of animals spread northward. Rising seas reshaped the coasts, turning former hills into islands and drowning ancient valleys. The hunters of the early warm period learned to live with these transformations. Their tools, camps, and food remains reveal how they adjusted from a world dominated by reindeer to one filled with deer, wild boar, birds, fish, and the resources of the sea. The stone technology of these centuries grew increasingly varied. Small geometric arrow tips appeared, crafted from slender blades that were snapped and trimmed with great skill. Axes of chipped flint were used for woodworking, while later generations polished harder stones to create heavier tools. Fishing gear multiplied. Hooks carved from bone, spears with multiple prongs. Nets weighted and floated with carefully shaped pieces of wood. Toward the end of the period, pottery entered the scene, not from the farming cultures to the south as once believed, but through long-distance contacts reaching from the east across the northern forests. Where preservation has been kind, the everyday equipment of these people comes to light in remarkable detail. Wooden paddles, fragments of canoes, woven fibres, and even traces of bark flooring have survived in waterlogged soils. These objects remind us that stone was only one part of a much broader technology, much of it made from materials that usually disappear without trace. The early post-glacial climate was relatively warm and stable, and life along the coasts must have been especially rewarding. Seas that were rising year by year teemed with fish, shellfish, seals, and occasional whales. Inland forests supported red deer, roe deer, and wild pigs. Dogs, already domesticated, accompanied human groups and likely helped in the hunt. The mixture of land and seafoods can be read directly from the chemistry of ancient bones. Measurements from human skeletons show that people living near the water relied heavily on marine protein, in some cases as much as the Arctic hunters of recent centuries. Only, with the coming of agriculture, did diets shift decisively toward domesticated crops and livestock. The changing shoreline had a powerful effect on what survives for archaeologists to find. Many of the earliest coastal camps now lie deep beneath the Baltic and North Seas. Lost to the steady rise of water, the sites that remain on dry land often represent only the inland side of a way of life that was far more maritime than once imagined. Across southern Scandinavia, a sequence of traditions can be traced. The earliest of these, known today from bogs and former lake margins, consisted of small camps occupied mainly in the warmer months. People fished for pike and sheatfish, hunted deer and wild boar, and gathered nuts and berries. Huts were light structures, their floors sometimes marked by shallow pits, filled with tools and food debris. Burials were rare, suggesting that communities were mobile and that many resting places now lie beneath modern waters. A few centuries later, settlements grew larger and more complex. At a site beside an ancient fjord on Zealand, careful excavation revealed circular houses partly sunk into the ground. Within one of these dwellings, 3 successive floors had been laid down, each with its own hearth. Stone flakes showed that tools were made inside the hut, while antlers and unusual objects hinted at ritual acts performed near the fire. Human bones discovered on the floor may have been deliberately brought from a nearby grave, suggesting that the boundary between the living and the dead was close and permeable. Outside the houses lay a cluster of burials. In one grave, an adult man and a child rested together, accompanied by deer-tooth pendants and a carved stone shaped like a phallus. The man's skull bore a terrible wound that had never healed. Another grave held the body of a small boy, wrapped in skin and dusted with red ochre. A smooth stone had been placed beneath his head and a small pebble in his mouth. From his skull, modern specialists were able to reconstruct a face, giving a fleeting human presence to a life lived 7,500 years ago. Toward the end of the Hunter era, communities along the Danish and North German coasts developed a distinctive culture centered on the sea. Their settlements often lay directly at the water's edge, leaving thick layers of refuse rich with shells, bones, and broken tools. Pottery bowls and pointed vessels appeared, perhaps used to cook fish oils or store food. Long dugout canoes allowed travel along the intricate coastline, and wooden paddles show the wear of many journeys. One of the most revealing of these coastal places now lies beneath shallow water near the island of Funen. Divers uncovered a site where the dry land portion had been washed away by waves. But the underwater refuse layers remained intact. Here were fragments of bows, boned fish hooks, still tied to plant fibre line, and stakes from fishing fences that once guided eels into traps. 3 canoes had been intentionally sunk, perhaps to keep the wood from drying. One, carved from a lime trunk, was long enough to carry 6 people, and even held the traces of a small hearth, used for night fishing. The animal remains from this submerged camp tell of a diet balanced between forest and sea. Deer and boar were hunted on land, yet the bulk of food came from cod, eel, and other fish. Dolphins were butchered on the beach and carried inland in large cuts, while seals and occasional whales added to the bounty. Plant foods were not forgotten. Hazelnuts, berries, and apples left their marks in the soil, and fibres from nettles and lime bark were spun into cords and nets. Farther north, along the rocky coast of western Sweden and eastern Norway, related communities followed similar paths. As the land slowly rose from the weight of former glaciers, old beaches were lifted high above the present sea, preserving early camps that elsewhere would have drowned. At a place called Husbyklev, deep layers of clay sealed an occupation more than 10,000 years old. Among the finds were bundles of dolphin vertebrae, pieces of birch resin chewed by human teeth, and a bone point still fastened to its wooden arrow shaft. The inhabitants here clearly relied on the sea, perhaps even driving dolphins into the long, narrow inlet where the camp stood. Other sites from the same region show different emphases. At Damen, the remains point to intensive fishing and winter residence, while at Baltorp, hunters focused more on aurochs and other large land animals. Such contrasts reveal a flexible economy in which groups shifted between coast and interior according to season and opportunity. The character of the Mesolithic world in Norway was never uniform. Life in the southern districts unfolded differently from that in the far north, shaped by contrasts in climate, coastline, and connections with neighbouring regions. Communities living below Stavanger looked southward and eastward in their habits and material culture, sharing much with southeastern Norway and the lands of southern Scandinavia. Farther north, the picture shifted, and the traditions of northern Sweden and the Arctic coast became more influential. At the dawn of the Holocene, the western and southern shores were occupied by people whose way of life is often associated with the Hensbacka and Fosna traditions. As centuries passed, new phases followed, commonly described as a middle and then a late Mesolithic, the latter sometimes known as the Nøstved horizon. The earliest phase faded around 8,000 years before the present era. The middle stage ended roughly 2,000 years later, and the late Mesolithic endured until about 4,000 years before the present, when the first currents of Neolithic influence reached these coasts. What those influences meant in terms of crops and animal husbandry remains uncertain, for the transition was slow and uneven. Western Norway offered a landscape that was more sea than land. Chains of low islands and skerries lay scattered across channels of swift water, and narrow fjords cut deep into the mountains. In Mesolithic times, as today, this setting was extraordinarily rich in food. Fish gathered in the tidal streams, seabirds nested on the cliffs, and marine mammals followed the currents. Excavations along one of these waterways revealed a long sequence of occupation. At a place known as Kotedalen, 10 distinct layers were uncovered, 5 belonging to the Mesolithic and 5 to later times. The older horizons dated between roughly 66 and 56 centuries before the present and showed a community drawing on a remarkably wide range of resources. Thousands of fish bones lay in the soil, mixed with the remains of red deer, hare, wild boar, otter, fox, and seal. Bird species included herons, puffins, razorbills, and auks. Cod, catfish, plaice, mackerel, herring, salmon, saithe, and pollack formed the core of the diet, and the tools of fishing, hooks and net sinkers, were scattered through the layers. People also gathered plants. Seeds of raspberry and wild peas appeared beside heaps of burned hazelnut shells. The pattern of growth in these remains suggested that the site was used in summer, autumn, and winter alike, pointing toward a settled community, rather than a passing camp. Stone for tools had sometimes been carried from quarries more than 100 kilometers away, a sign that these people traveled widely or maintained networks of exchange. Farther north, along the same rugged coast, lies Vingen, one of the most striking monuments of prehistoric art in Europe. The fjord is framed by steep peaks, waterfalls, and the restless blue of the sea. On the flat rocks of a broad terrace, hundreds of animals were carved in ancient times. Red deer dominate the scenes, joined by moose, reindeer, wolves or dogs, whales, porpoises, birds, and a few serpents. Human figures appear rarely. Some boulders bear only a single image, others carry 200. Small huts that once stood among the carvings have been dated to the centuries between 5 and 4,000 years before the present, suggesting when this artistic outburst took place. The engravings were cut directly into the stone and must have required long hours of patient work, perhaps tied to ritual gatherings at this dramatic place. In northern Norway, the story unfolded along a different rhythm. The earliest settlers, often grouped under the name Komsa, arrived by sea while the interior still lay close to the retreating ice. Their tools resemble those of the southern coast and even of late Paleolithic traditions farther south. Yet over time, new forms emerged. By the middle, Mesolithic small bladelets and microcores were common, alongside larger blades and flake scrapers. Later still, trapezoidal arrow points and the technique of bipolar reduction appeared, in which a core was set on an anvil stone and struck from above to produce flakes. Polished slate tools and the first pottery eventually joined this toolkit, though the overall way of life remained rooted in hunting and fishing. The preservation of northern sites is often excellent. Thin soils and sparse vegetation have left ancient floors close to the surface. In Finnmark, hundreds of settlements are known, some containing up to 90 house foundations. Bones of seals and other marine mammals show how vital the sea was, and the evidence suggests that many of these communities were occupied throughout the year. One of the most revealing discoveries came near Tromsø, where 3 large rectangular dwellings were found beneath peat. Each measured around 10 meters in length and had stone-lined walls, interior pits, and paired posts to carry a roof. These may be among the oldest permanent houses yet recognized in northern Europe, their entrances opening toward the water that provided sustenance. Contacts from the east also reached this region. A few sites in extreme northeastern Norway belong to the early northern comb ware tradition, known mainly from Finland and Russia. These people made pottery, decorated with comb-like impressions, long before ceramics arrived in southern Scandinavia. Their stone tools were largely fashioned from quartz, and later generations favoured slate. Such finds reveal that the northern world was never isolated. Ideas and techniques travelled across great distances. Central Sweden tells another chapter of the same tale. The ice lingered here longer, and the first communities arrived relatively late. Much of the landscape was an archipelago of gravel ridges and rocky islands gradually rising from the sea. Sites are often small, scatters of quartz or flint with little organic preservation, making interpretation difficult. Debate continues over whether different raw materials represent separate cultures or simply varied choices within a single tradition. Shoreline changes provide the main guide to chronology, and by about 6,000 years before the present, a recognizable middle Mesolithic had taken shape, followed by a brief late phase on the eve of farming. Near the outlet of Lake Fetton, an extraordinary discovery transformed understanding of ritual life. At a place called Kanaljorden, archaeologists uncovered a square stone platform built on the floor of a shallow lake. Among the stones lay wooden stakes, carved objects, animal bones, and the skulls of at least 11 people. 2 crania still held fragments of the stakes inside them, as if they had once been displayed above the water, the dates clustered around 6,000 years ago. Nothing like this had been seen before, and the meaning of the deposit, whether honouring ancestors or proclaiming victory over enemies, remains an open question. Northern Sweden, freed late from the ice, preserves some of the earliest traces of human arrival in the entire peninsula. The site of Aryavara, once a small island in a vast freshwater lake, was occupied almost as soon as the glaciers retreated. Birch and dwarf willow surrounded the camp, and reindeer, seals, and fish likely sustained its inhabitants. Later, coastal sites such as Altrasket reveal semi-subterranean houses with benches along the walls, boiling pits, and hearths, evidence of communities adapting confidently to their environment. Across Scandinavia, several themes recur. The first is the central importance of the sea. Even where terrestrial animals like red deer, roe deer, and wild boar were common, marine foods often formed the bulk of the diet. Shell middens stretched for hundreds of meters along favoured shores, testimony to generations of repeated visits. Rising waters have drowned many early coastal camps, but those preserved on uplifted land show that people fished with hooks and nets, built weirs, and hunted seals and even whales. Settlements gradually became more permanent. Early groups moved seasonally between lakes and forests, yet by the middle, Mesolithic, substantial villages existed beside the water. Houses were rare in the archaeological record but are now increasingly recognised. Cemeteries appeared within these communities, revealing care for the dead and hints of social complexity. Skeletons are generally robust, though many bear signs of violent injury, suggesting that conflict was not unknown. The graves at Vedbeck illustrate this vividly. More than 20 individuals were buried there, some adorned with ochre, others accompanied by antler racks or tooth pendants. One newborn lay on the wing of a swan beside his mother. Another grave held a man killed by a bone point in his throat, interred with a woman and child, perhaps victims of the same event. At Stroby, Egede, 8 people of different ages were laid together with flint knives and ornaments, their story lost to time. Art flourished in subtle forms. Bone, antler, amber, and slate were engraved with fine geometric lines or shaped into animal figures. A decorated aurochs bone from Denmark shows stylized human shapes approaching zigzag bands that may represent water. Antler axes from Sweden and Germany carry rows of tiny lozenges or tally marks, perhaps records of hunts or journeys. Slotted bone daggers set with razor-sharp flint blades display both craftsmanship and beauty. Amber pendants in the likeness of elk, seal, or boar were worn as amulets, and clusters of animal and even human teeth were arranged as mysterious ornaments. Taken together, these traces reveal societies that were far from simple. The transformation from late Paleolithic hunters to Mesolithic coastal peoples brought larger communities, broader diets, and new forms of expression. Boats allowed movement along the intricate shorelines, while inland camps continued to exploit forests and rivers. Some groups lived year-round beside the sea. Others followed seasonal rounds between coast and interior. Chemical studies of dog and human bones show that many individuals depended almost entirely on marine foods, while others relied on terrestrial game, confirming the coexistence of distinct ways of life. Rather than small wandering bands on the edge of survival, these people formed resilient and adaptable societies. Their environment was rich, and food shortages were probably rare. Networks of exchange carried stone and ideas over great distances. The appearance of cemeteries and monumental art points to shared beliefs and social bonds. Even when farming appeared to the south, the hunters of Scandinavia adopted it slowly, choosing to maintain a successful tradition for many generations. The Mesolithic world of Norway and Sweden was therefore a mosaic of communities linked by the sea and shaped by changing landscapes. From the carved cliffs of Vingen to the submerged platform of Kanaljorden, from the houses of Tromsø to the camps of Aryavara, the evidence speaks of people who understood their surroundings intimately and crafted lives of skill and imagination. Their legacy endures not only in artifacts, but in the very pattern of human settlement across the northern lands. The first farming communities that reached southern Scandinavia did not arrive in an empty or welcoming landscape. The region was covered by dense primeval forest, a green barrier of oak, lime, and hazel that allowed only narrow corridors of movement. Open meadows were rare, and natural clearings were few. For people who wished to grow crops and keep herds, the forest itself became the greatest challenge. Before fields could be planted or animals could graze, the trees had to fall. The key to this transformation was a new tool, the polished flint axe. Earlier, Stone Age implements had been made by striking flakes from cores, creating sharp but fragile edges. Those light tools were well suited for cutting meat or shaping small pieces of wood, yet they were useless against massive trunks. The polished axe was different. It was heavy, durable, and could be sharpened again and again. With such an instrument, even the thickest tree could eventually be brought to the ground. Across Denmark, southern Sweden, and parts of Norway, tens of thousands of these axes have been found. Most were crafted from large blocks of high-quality flint. The surface was ground smooth, often on every side, giving the tool a shining, almost ceremonial appearance. The blade was set into an ash handle, creating a powerful lever in human hands. Some examples reached extraordinary sizes, longer than a human forearm, suggesting not only practical use, but also prestige and value. Modern experiments have shown just how effective these tools were. Archaeologists and craftspeople in Denmark and Sweden have recreated the axes using ancient methods. In open-air research centres, they have tested them against living trees. The results were surprising. A hardwood trunk the width of a man's thigh could be felled in little more than 10 minutes. What once seemed an impossible task for Stone Age farmers proved entirely within their reach. Yet producing a single axe required immense effort. The maker first selected a suitable nodule of flint, then shaped it roughly with hammerstones. Antler tools refined the form, and indirect flaking created the cutting edge. Only after hours of work did the long process of polishing begin. Sand, water, and another stone were used to grind the surface smooth. Experiments suggest that nearly 30 hours of polishing alone were needed, and the axe might travel dozens of kilometers, back and forth across the grinding stone before it was finished. In total, more than a day and a half of concentrated labour went into one object. At first, these axes were polished, from tip to butt, even where it added no strength. Over time, the craftsmen abandoned this unnecessary effort, yet the early pieces remained as symbols of the new age. They marked the moment when the forest began to retreat and the first fields took shape. The spread of farming across Scandinavia followed the geography of the north. Climate drew an invisible line through the middle of Sweden and along the sheltered coast of Norway. South of that line, barley could ripen, and wheat could grow. North of it, the old way of life continued longer, tied to hunting, fishing, and the rhythms of the sea. Archaeologists divide the early farming period into several phases. The first centuries after 4000 BC saw the arrival of what is now called the funnel beaker tradition, named after the elegant pottery with flaring necks. This culture dominated southern Scandinavia for more than a millennium. During its early stage, small communities experimented with cultivation while still relying heavily on wild resources. Later generations expanded their fields, built monuments, and reshaped the landscape on a grander scale. One question has haunted researchers for decades. Why did successful hunters choose to become farmers at all? Along the Baltic coast, people had lived well on fish, seals, wild pigs, and red deer. Trade with farmers to the south had existed for centuries, without changing this way of life. Then, within only a few generations, everything altered. Domestic cattle and sheep appeared, new pottery styles spread, and polished axes replaced the old tools. Some scholars have imagined pressure from growing populations. Others have blamed environmental change. Yet skeletons from the last hunters show strong bodies and healthy diets. There is little sign of crisis. Instead, the decision to farm may have been social rather than desperate. Cultivation created surplus, and surplus created opportunity. New leaders could display wealth, organize feasts, and build alliances. Farming may have offered not only food but power and prestige. The speed of the transformation was remarkable. From northern Germany to the Stockholm region, nearly 500,000 square kilometers adopted the new way of life in only a few centuries. Pottery, axes, and domesticated animals appeared almost at the same moment across this vast area, suggesting movement of people as well as ideas. Excavations along the former Baltic shoreline have revealed settlements from this turning point. At one site in northern Germany, houses stood beside a lagoon that has since become dry land. The layers of occupation show the shift clearly. Older levels are filled with seal bones, fish remains, and hazelnut shells. Above them lie the first traces of sheep, cattle, and wheat. Wooden paddles, spear shafts, and axe handles were preserved in the wet soil, giving a vivid picture of daily life. The earliest farms were modest. Houses were long and narrow, with a central row of posts supporting the roof. Around them lay thin layers of rubbish, scattered potsherds, and hearths. Families were small, and settlements often moved a short distance every generation, perhaps following fresh soil for new fields. Pottery became a defining feature of the age. Vessels with funnel-shaped necks, bowls, and small flasks were carefully formed and sometimes decorated with simple patterns. Large pots served for cooking and storage, while tiny cups may have been used for drink, perhaps even for early beer brewed from barley. Cattle soon dominated the herds. They provided meat, milk, hides, and bone for tools. Pigs roamed the forests, and sheep and goats added wool and additional food. Hunting never disappeared, especially near the coasts, where seals and fish continued to feed many communities. Across the countryside, new kinds of places appeared. Flint mines opened where chalk layers offered the best raw material. Sacred deposits were placed in bogs and lakes, axes, pots, even human remains. Most impressive were the great stone tombs. These megalithic monuments, built of massive boulders, served as collective graves and visible claims to the land. Around them, villages gathered, and rituals bound generations together. Trade linked Scandinavia to distant worlds. Amber from Baltic beaches travelled south, while copper axes and ornaments arrived from the Alpine and Balkan mountains. Some stone weapons were shaped to imitate metal blades, never seen locally. Wealth and identity became intertwined, and objects spoke of status as clearly as any crown. By the middle of the 4th millennium, BC, the transformation was complete. Forests had been opened into patchworks of fields and pasture. Settlements grew larger, and communities cooperated in building enclosures and monuments. The landscape itself had become a human creation. The landscape around Almhov in southern Sweden revealed one of the largest windows into early farming life ever opened in Scandinavia. When archaeologists began their work, they did not expect the scale that would emerge beneath the soil. Over an area of nearly 10 hectares, the ground slowly surrendered traces of houses, graves, pits, and forgotten ceremonies. More than 1,000 post holes appeared in the earth, marking the places where timber walls once stood. Hundreds of pits lay scattered between them, silent witnesses to daily labour and ritual gatherings. Most of the early remains clustered within a broad circle only a few hundred metres across. Inside this zone, nearly 200 pits dated to the first centuries of farming. They were filled with broken pottery, worked antler, flint tools and animal bones, ordinary refuse from cooking, crafting and living. Yet among these everyday traces were signs of something less ordinary. Some pits had been arranged in pairs or small groups and contained unusual combinations of objects, as if the soil had been deliberately fed with gifts after moments of feasting. These special pits formed a great ring around the settlement, almost 200 metres in diameter. Behind each pair of pits stood two massive posts, perhaps supporting wooden facades or markers visible from afar. To the west lay the outlines of large earthen barrows, early tombs that must have dominated the horizon. In front of them were clear spaces where no digging had taken place, suggesting areas reserved for gatherings, ceremonies, or quiet respect for the dead. Within the same landscape stood two stone dolmens and at least a couple of houses, proving that life and death shared the same ground. What makes Almhof truly remarkable is its age. The earliest traces reach back to the very beginning of farming in Scandinavia, around 4000 BC. These dates are almost identical to those from northern Germany, hinting that this coastal region may have been one of the gateways through which agriculture first entered the north. The abundance of high-quality flint nearby would have made the area especially attractive to newcomers carrying new tools and new ideas. A short distance away lay another key site, discovered during the preparations for the Great Bridge linking Sweden and Denmark. The place, once used as a modern shooting range, turned out to hide layers from both the last hunter-gatherers and the first farmers. An ancient beach ridge ran through the area, marking the shoreline of a long, vanished sea. Beneath and within that ridge were traces of late Mesolithic life. Above it lay the remains of the earliest Neolithic occupation. Across thousands of square metres, archaeologists uncovered hearths, pits, and working areas for flint. The older layers were filled with the bones of cod and seal, with red deer and wild boar, echoes of a world still ruled by hunting and fishing. In the upper layers appeared the first polished flint axes and new styles of pottery. Among them were vessels decorated in ways that blended old traditions with new forms, as if the people themselves were learning to live between two eras. Only a few domestic animals were found at this coastal camp, suggesting that herding played a minor role here. The settlement seems to have remained closely tied to the sea, perhaps serving as a seasonal station where fishing and sealing continued long after farming had begun inland. Just a few kilometres away, at Almhof, the picture was very different. Cereals, cattle, tombs, and ritual enclosures announced a fully agricultural world. The contrast shows how uneven and gradual the transition could be, even within the same region. Far to the north, around the Great Lakes west of Stockholm, early farmers also left their mark. The area known as Skogsmossen lay near the ancient coast, and across a wide zone, archaeologists found the remains of a house, places where axes were made, cooking spots, and a small sacred wetland. In that bog, two pools of water held the traces of wooden platforms and clay-lined hearths built above the surface. Around them lay masses of broken pottery and tools that had been burned before deposition. Among the vessels were cups and flasks, typical of the funnel beaker tradition. Chemical analysis of one pot revealed residues of milk, clear evidence that cattle were already part of daily life. The objects had not been discarded casually. Many were intentionally smashed, and as if destruction itself had been an offering. The bog appears to have been a household sanctuary where people asked for protection or thanked unseen powers for harvest and herd. In Norway, the story unfolded differently. Along the Oslo fjord, polished flint axes and a few megaliths show that farming ideas reached this corner early. But farther west, the old maritime way of life remained strong. At Kotadalen, near Bergen, layers of occupation stretch from the late Mesolithic deep into the Neolithic. The site lay beside powerful tidal currents rich with fish, and generation after generation returned to the same shore. After 4000 BC, the settlement grew larger and more permanent. New kinds of stone tools appeared, and flint of Danish origin reached the site, yet domestic animals were absent from the bones. Pottery arrived before agriculture did, and for several centuries the community seems to have been Neolithic in style rather than in economy. Fishing gear dominated the finds, net sinkers, bone hooks, and tools for processing the catch. Only much later do hints of barley and pasture plants appear in the pollen. The coast of western Norway shows how the Neolithic could be adopted selectively, filtered through local needs and traditions. Elsewhere in Scandinavia, the hunger for flint reshaped the earth itself. Where chalk beds lay close to the surface, people dug deep shafts to reach large, flawless nodules. Networks of mines spread across Jutland and Skåne. The work was dangerous, but the reward was the material for polished axes that travelled hundreds of kilometres. Some mines date to the very beginning of farming, proving how quickly demand arose for these powerful tools. Not all traces of the New Age were practical. Lakes and bogs received offerings that speak of belief and fear. Whole pots filled with food were lowered into dark water. Axes, amber necklaces, and even copper ornaments disappeared beneath the surface. In a few places, animals and people were sacrificed. Such acts removed wealth from everyday use, but they bound communities together and affirmed their relationship with unseen forces. The most visible monuments of all were the Great Tombs. Across southern Scandinavia, thousands of earthen barrows, dolmens, and passage graves rose above the fields. Early barrows were built of timber and earth and often held only a single burial, marking the emergence of privileged individuals. Later, stone chambers became communal houses of the dead, where many generations rested side by side. At entrances to these tombs, pottery filled with food was placed again and again, long after the original burials had faded into memory. Some landscapes combined tombs with even larger ceremonial centres. At Sarup on the island of Finn, a massive enclosure was built on a narrow peninsula around 3400 BC. A towering palisade of oak, hundreds of metres long, sealed off the tip of the land. Outside the wall lay rows of segmented ditches filled with unusual deposits, whole pots, animal skulls, and fragments of human bone. The site appears to have hosted gatherings of many communities, perhaps for funerals, feasts, and negotiations between living and dead. The enclosure did not stand alone. Around it spread a network of small farmsteads and more than 100 megalithic tombs. Each cluster of tombs may have marked a territory or lineage, while the great palisade served as their shared meeting ground. The labour required to build it was immense, and the cooperation involved must have strengthened bonds across the region. Similar monumental landscapes appeared elsewhere. In southern Sweden, a long double palisade ran along a ridge dotted with megaliths, while later in the Middle Neolithic, vast oval enclosures were erected, their purpose still debated. They may have been places of assembly, arenas for trade, or pens for great herds, but they also became stages for the dramatic breaking and burning of flint in large ritual events. Archaeology in southwestern Sweden has been quietly transformed by modern construction. As new roads and rail lines were pushed through the landscape around the Öresund Bridge and the growth that followed, teams began opening large areas that had never been examined at this scale before. This corner of Sweden is already famous for early farming period graves and objects, so major finds were always possible. But the work south of Malmö in 2007 still surprised almost everyone. As a highway expansion peeled back the soil, an entire early Neolithic ritual landscape appeared, where nothing obvious had been visible on the surface. What emerged was not a single monument, but a whole complex. At least 20 megalithic tombs, a double wooden barrier running across the ridge, upright stones set as markers, and additional features that only became clear as the excavation widened. Inside and around the graves were rich deposits of pottery and flint tools, along with carefully placed offerings that suggest repeated ceremonial activity rather than one-time events. Before this discovery, Sweden was not thought to contain such large, elaborate early tomb complexes, tied to equally dramatic surrounding structures. The dating places the main activity within a few centuries, around 3500 BC, at the site now known as Döserig, often described as a dolmen ridge because the burials line a long, narrow rise in the terrain. The most striking element was the long double palisade. It followed the edge of the ridge for more than 700 metres, with wetland lying to the west, and it was built with thick posts placed so close together that the barrier would have looked almost continuous. The builders dug a shallow trench, set the posts into it, and packed stones around them as support. Reconstructing the labour behind it is staggering. More than 5,000 trees may have been cut to supply the timber, and that is before accounting for the effort of hauling, shaping, and setting each post. Along this wooden line, large standing stones were also raised, extending the message of the enclosure into a more permanent material. In the zone where the megalithic tombs were concentrated, there were at least 3 carefully formed entrances, suggesting controlled points of access, rather than a simple fence. The full ends of the structure have still not been found, hinting that it may have been even longer. Later, survey work using ground-penetrating radar traced the barrier farther east, where it bends north, a twist that makes the whole construction feel less like a straight boundary and more like an intentional enclosure. In its overall concept, it begins to resemble unusual fenced ceremonial areas, known from southern Scandinavia and northern Germany, where walls and openings guide movement and frame ritual space. Seen as a whole, Döserig does not read like an ordinary burial ground. It looks like a place designed to be recognised, approached, and remembered. Its position suggests it may have stood near a crossing point in local routes, a spot where people, animals, and goods regularly pass through the landscape. The wooden wall and the line of standing stones would have made that significance unavoidable, shaping how visitors entered and how gatherings were organised. And the tombs themselves, built in stone, endured far beyond the lives of their builders. For centuries and then for millennia, they would have remained as visible anchors on the ridge, linking communities to the dead and reinforcing a story of ancestry tied to land. In a world where early farming was still new, such monuments could declare permanence, ownership, and identity without any written record. They turned a piece of terrain into a statement about who belonged there and why. Other remarkable finds from this early farming era across Scandinavia show the same mix of skill, symbolism, and long-distance connection. Some of the most impressive treasures are not single objects at all, but the surviving tombs, scattered across fields and forests today, still outlining the footprint of early communities. Yet individual artifacts also reveal the care invested in beauty and display. In Denmark, a famous example comes from skarpsåling, a finely made funnel beaker bowl, tall and carefully shaped, with decoration cut into the clay, before firing. The grooves were then filled with a light material so the pattern would stand out sharply against the darker surface. It was not everyday kitchenware. Its finish and complexity point towards ceremonies and formal gatherings, where vessels were meant to be noticed. Found in a burial mound and dated to around 3200 BC, it shows that pottery could function as a marker of status, identity, and ritual taste, not merely as a container. Another Danish discovery, near Bigholm, reveals something even more unexpected for the new Stone Age: early metal. A hoard was uncovered containing some of the earliest copper objects known in Scandinavia, dated close to 3500 BC. There was a dagger blade, several axe blades, and spiral armbands, a small set, but a powerful signal. These were not random scraps. They were finished tools and ornaments, and the pattern of finds suggests that copper axes were more often placed in hoards than in graves. The metal itself carries a clue to its origin. Trace elements indicate a Central European source, which means these objects arrived through exchange networks that reached far beyond Scandinavia. Even at this early date, communities were not isolated. They were connected into chains of movement, where rare materials could travel hundreds of kilometers, accumulating meaning as they went. Not all discoveries from this period are about wealth or craftsmanship. One human skeleton from Denmark, found in a bog in the mid-20th century, offers a more unsettling window into Neolithic life. The man was about 35 to 40 years old and died around 3500 BC. A bone arrow point was embedded in his skull, driven through his nose at a steep downward angle into the upper jaw. A second projectile pierced his breastbone and was likely fatal. The bog preserved the bones and the weapons, leaving a brutal record of a violent moment that would otherwise have vanished. Studies of skull injuries from Neolithic Denmark and Sweden suggest that trauma was not rare, and that both men and women show signs of repeated, non-lethal violence. Denmark appears to have higher rates than Sweden in the available samples. The picture that emerges is not one of constant warfare, but of communities where conflict, assault, and injury were familiar parts of life alongside farming, ritual, and trade. When these strands are pulled together, the shift to agriculture in Scandinavia appears less like a single clean revolution and more like a long, uneven transformation. Farming began to take root with the arrival of the funnel beaker world around 4000 BC, but the full change was not immediate. For centuries, people experimented, adopted, resisted, and mixed old and new ways. Over time, landscapes were opened through clearing, and new tools made cultivation more practical. Monument building exploded, with tens of thousands of tombs and large wooden and earth structures reshaping the countryside. The energy poured into ceremonies is hard to ignore. Wetlands received offerings, animals, food, and valuable objects were placed in ways that look deliberate and repeated. Some deposits include the bodies of sacrificed people, often young, suggesting that ritual could demand a terrible price. At the same time, artisans produced some of the most elaborate ceramics in Scandinavian prehistory and created large, carefully made flint axes. Many of these objects were not simply used and discarded. They were broken, burned, or buried as part of ritual acts that turned material wealth into spiritual or social power. This changing world also brought new kinds of organization. Exchange networks spread polished axes, flint, amber, and other goods across wide regions, binding communities together through movement and obligation. As food surpluses grew and populations increased, inequality likely expanded as well. Status could be formalized in burial, displayed in objects, and reinforced through shared ceremonies. The pace of change, however, was contradictory. From the earliest contacts between northern foragers and farming societies to the point where agriculture truly dominated. The process stretched across more than 1,000 years, roughly from 5000 BC to 3500 BC. Long before people fully farmed, they were already acquiring southern objects and ideas, and some communities may have been partly settled, while still relying heavily on wild resources. Even after farming began spreading, its components did not arrive everywhere in the same order. Pottery styles changed over time, some more local and others more regional. Long earthen tombs appeared and then gave way to megalithic stone graves. Enclosures and megaliths seem to have peaked within a relatively short window of a few centuries. Wetland offerings became more intense later rather than earlier. Copper imports rose and then fell, likely responding to disruptions far away. Large-scale forest clearance and the broad expansion of fields appear later than many people expect, suggesting that early farming did not instantly turn the land into open agricultural country. And yet, in another sense, the spread was astonishingly fast. After 4000 BC, domesticated plants and animals and the characteristic pottery of the new way of life appeared across Denmark, southern and middle Sweden, and parts of Norway within just a few centuries. It is hard to picture such a rapid and coordinated change without people who already understood farming methods, animal care, seasonal cycles, and the social rules that came with them. Some degree of migration or colonization likely accompanied the expansion, not necessarily as a single wave, but a steady movement of knowledgeable individuals and groups into new areas. Rather than blaming the transition on climate or simple population pressure, the most convincing explanations focus on human decision-making. Contact between foragers and farmers, especially through exchange, offered new goods and new ideas that could make farming attractive even before it was strictly necessary for survival. In this view, agriculture spread not just because it produced food, but because it opened doors to prestige objects, to wider networks, to new forms of leadership, and to social systems that rewarded those who could control surplus and connections. From there, the story continues into a later Neolithic world shaped by new cultural currents, especially after about 2800 BC. In southern Scandinavia, the period is often divided into early, middle, and late phases, with major shifts occurring at the end of the earlier farming tradition. New cultural patterns appear that are tied to wider European movements. One of the best known is the corded ware horizon, widespread from the Netherlands across Central and Eastern Europe, reaching into Denmark, southern and middle Sweden, and the Norwegian coast. Its origins are debated, with some arguments pointing toward steppe-related expansions and others suggesting development within Central Europe. Whatever its beginnings, it was not a single uniform people in every place. It looks more like a broad zone where different communities shared certain objects and burial customs, while still maintaining local variation. The name itself comes from pottery, decorated with cord impressions, while terms like single grave and battle axe refer to burial practices and characteristic male grave goods. In Denmark, especially in Jylland, the single grave pattern is visible in low round mounds, with individual burials in plank coffins. Grave gifts tend to follow a recognizable script. Battle axes and flint tools for men, amber necklaces for women, and ceramic vessels that likely held fermented drink for both. The repeated structure of these burials has been interpreted as a sign that men and women held comparable social standing in death, at least within the rules of this tradition. In Sweden, the related battle axe culture is strongest in Skåne, but appears across much of the southern peninsula. The burial customs differ. Many graves are flat rather than under mounds, and bodies are arranged with careful orientation, with men and women placed on different sides. Grave goods again follow patterns, including pottery, flint axes, amber, and the boat-shaped battle axes that give the culture one of its names. Settlement traces are often light and scattered, leading some researchers to imagine a more mobile way of life tied to herding and short-lived gathering places. At the same time, another tradition flourished along coasts and islands. The pitted ware world, recognisable by pottery covered in deep impressions and by economies strongly focused on hunting, fishing and gathering, especially seal hunting in many areas. In eastern Sweden, agriculture seems to have weakened or retreated in some regions, replaced by intense marine exploitation. Pitted ware settlements often sit on older sites, suggesting continuity of favoured locations even as lifestyles changed. Their toolkits include specialised fishing gear and distinctive projectile points, and their graves sometimes contain tooth pendants, hooks, harpoons, and pottery, reflecting identities shaped by the sea. The relationship between pitted ware groups and battle axe groups remains controversial. Some see two separate cultures with different ways of life, while others argue they may represent interconnected parts of a single shifting society using the landscape in different seasons or for different purposes. In Western Skåne, modern excavations tied to infrastructure projects have revealed how dynamic this region was across 1500 years. Early farming communities reused places that had been important to late hunter-gatherers. Over time, investment in fields and pasture created a deep sense of attachment to land, and the building of megalithic tombs after about 3600 BC likely reinforced that permanence by turning ancestors into landmarks. Later, ritual activity intensified, with wetland deposits increasing in number and richness, while settlement patterns shifted and populations clustered. Toward the end of this earlier tradition, signs of tension appear in the changing distribution of sites and the mixing of influences, as if the old order was fraying. When battle axe traditions emerged after 2800 BC, their footprint in this area looks different. Fewer long-lived settlements, more temporary traces, and evidence for large communal enclosures that may have hosted gatherings, craft production, or the management of livestock. One enclosure near Malmö, oval and vast, was built with multiple rows of thick posts and several entrances. Inside, large quantities of flint debris suggest shared production of polished axes. Such places may also have served as corrals, where herds could be combined for breeding, exchange, or sale, tying social relationships to practical needs and collective organization. Further north and east, other sites show how varied this later Neolithic world could be. A wooden platform structure built out into a bog in middle Sweden was constructed with pilings, floors, rooms, fireplaces, and a surrounding fence connected to land by a boardwalk. It seems to have been used seasonally and then, after decades, became a place where the dead were laid out, hinting at ceremonies that blended feasting, gathering, and mortuary practice. On Gotland, a vast coastal settlement and cemetery reveal a community whose diet was dominated by marine foods, confirmed by both animal remains and chemical traces from human bones. Burials include adults and children in proportions that suggest an ordinary living population. Yet some graves contain striking clusters of objects, and some bodies were buried as bundled bones rather than complete skeletons, implying travel, delayed burial, or special treatment of the dead. In Norway, coastal sites with distinctive pottery and enormous quantities of points, axes, amber, and pumice show strong connections to the south, even while their animal remains emphasize marine hunting rather than farming. Across these regions, movement, exchange, and shifting identities appear again and again. By the time the late Neolithic begins around 2350 BC, trade and prestige goods intensify even further. New styles appear in northern Jylland, linked to the wider bell beaker phenomenon that spread across much of Western and Central Europe. In Scandinavia, these groups seem closely tied to exploration and exchange. They are associated with fine drinking vessels, flint daggers, amber buttons, and early metalwork. Their presence may reflect people seeking metals and other valuable materials, while also exporting high-quality flint products. Over time, the late Neolithic becomes known for the sheer scale of flint dagger production. Thousands have been recorded archaeologically, and the original number in circulation must have been vastly higher. These daggers often functioned as display objects, rather than practical tools, imitating metal forms with extraordinary stone craftsmanship. Producing them demanded skill, time, and access to large flint nodules, suggesting specialist artisans and organized training over generations. As metal became more common after about 2000 BC, Scandinavia moved gradually toward the Bronze Age, with increasing inequality visible in the size of houses, the richness of graves, and the concentration of imported materials. Longhouses grew larger, some becoming centres of power, while routes of movement and exchange became more strongly inscribed on the landscape. Beyond the farming south, northern Scandinavia followed a different path. In many areas, agriculture was not viable, so hunting, fishing, and gathering remained dominant. Yet even there, the period shows clear change. Pottery appears, slate technology becomes widespread, and houses become more substantial. Exotic objects, including southern amber and flint, demonstrate trade links reaching far distances. Some sites contain rows of house depressions along ancient shorelines, interpreted either as large seasonal aggregations or as repeated rebuilding over time. Rock art panels show boats, hunting scenes, and seasonal activities offering glimpses of daily life and belief. Along the Gulf of Bothnia, large coastal settlements focused heavily on seal hunting, using heavy net weights and taking advantage of winter vulnerabilities when seals calved on the ice. Inland, pit houses surrounded by heaps of fire-cracked stone suggest winter dwellings, built for insulation and repeated use. Over centuries, contact with southern Scandinavia increased, bringing new tools and occasional evidence for limited cultivation and herding along parts of the northern coast. But the broader pattern remained one of skilled adaptation to wild resources. Across all these regions, the Neolithic in Scandinavia looks less like a straight line from foraging to farming and more like a long experiment in how to live. Monument building, ritual offerings, long-distance exchange, and the slow rise of inequality all unfold alongside violence, mobility, and local variation. Places like Duserig stand out because they make that world visible in a single landscape. Stone tombs for the ancestors, a massive timber barrier shaped by communal labour, standing stones that turned movement into ceremony, and deposits that show repeated acts of meaning over time. It is a reminder that early farming societies were not only learning how to grow food and raise animals, they were also learning how to build memory into the land, how to mark identity through monuments, and how to bind communities together through shared work, shared ritual, and shared stories that could outlast any one generation. The story of northern Scandinavia's ancient art begins with one patient observer who spent decades wandering through forests, rapids, and lonely valleys in search of images left by people who lived thousands of years ago. The rock walls of this region are scattered with figures of animals, boats, and humans, yet many of them remained unnoticed until systematic exploration started in the early 20th century. The carvings are not small decorations. They are bold statements cut into hard stone, placed where rushing water, shining cliffs, and wide horizons shaped the daily experience of prehistoric communities. Among all these places, one location stands out as a true gallery of the past: the rapids of Nemforsen. At this bend of the Ångermanälven River, smooth rock surfaces rise from the white water like enormous natural canvases. For half a kilometre, the riverbanks and several islands are covered with thousands of images created mainly between 3500 and 2000 BC. The artists worked very close to the waterline, pecking the figures into polished granite. Almost 3,000 motifs have been recorded. Elk dominate the scenes, followed by boats filled with crews, smaller numbers of human figures, and occasional fish, birds, and mysterious signs shaped like footprints or hollow cups. The islands in the middle of the rapids carry the richest concentrations, as if these pieces of land were special stages where ceremonies and gatherings once took place. Nearby, traces of a long-lived settlement show that people returned to this place for thousands of years. Arrowheads, scrapers, pottery tempered with asbestos, and huge quantities of stone flakes reveal intense activity. Burned bones of beaver, salmon, pike, and trout suggest seasonal feasts connected to the river's resources, while the single seal bone hints at journeys toward the distant coast. Farther north, along the ancient shoreline, another site, Björselet, tells a different but equally remarkable story. Here, hunter-gatherers lived at the edge of the Baltic around 2800 to 2350 BC. Their diet was based on fish and seal, supplemented by elk, beaver, fox, and birds. Yet among the ordinary tools lay objects that could never have originated in this northern landscape. Finely made flint axes, adzes, and chisels crafted from stone found more than 1,000 kilometers to the south. Dozens of such items were buried in deliberate hoards around the settlement, sometimes placed upright, sometimes arranged in circles, often burned as if transformed by ritual fire. These deposits mirror practices known from distant Denmark, suggesting that ideas and perhaps people travelled along the coast of the Baltic. Modern scientific analysis has confirmed that the flint came from the region of eastern Denmark and southern Sweden. The evidence points toward visits, or even temporary colonies of battle axe communities, who may have exchanged prestigious stone tools for furs and other northern products. Scattered across Scandinavia are treasures that illuminate the artistry of these times. On the island of Gotland, a delicate bone comb was carved with the face of a human at one end and the head of an elk at the other, its handle covered with fine zigzag lines. In northern Sweden, a greenstone battle axe was shaped so that the butt formed a smiling moose. These objects were not meant for heavy work, they were symbols of identity and belief. In Denmark, the famous Hindsgavel dagger shows the technical peak of stone craftsmanship. Its thin blade was created by pressing off long, parallel flakes, imitating the form of rare bronze weapons from Central Europe. The reddish colour of the flint reveals that it once lay in a bog, placed there as an offering rather than discarded as a tool. All these finds belong to a long transformation known as the Neolithic. The shift from hunting to farming was not a sudden revolution, but a slow reshaping of landscapes and minds. Early farmers reused the camps of their Mesolithic ancestors, gradually clearing forests and creating fields. Ancestors became central to community life, and burial monuments rose across the countryside. During the middle part of this era, new groups arrived from the south and east, bringing different customs. Some societies turned again toward the sea and the hunt, while others followed the path of mobile cattle herders. Villages were few. Many people lived in temporary or shifting dwellings, leaving only faint traces in the soil. By the later Neolithic, long-distance trade intensified. Amber from the north and flint daggers of extraordinary quality travelled across Europe, while copper, gold, and eventually bronze reached Scandinavia in return. These networks prepared the ground for a new age in which metal would transform power and warfare. When the Bronze Age began around 1700 BC, southern Scandinavia, despite lacking its own ores, became one of the richest regions in Europe. More bronze swords have been found in Denmark than anywhere else on the continent. The wealth flowed through exchange routes that connected the cold north with the warm Mediterranean world. Along the Swedish west coast, the memory of that era is carved into bare rock faces. In Bohuslän, thousands of panels show ships, warriors, animals, and scenes of daily life. The images once lay directly at the shoreline. Today, the land has risen, leaving them high above the sea. The largest panels contain hundreds of figures, including processions of people, men fighting along lines of cut marks, and vessels crowded with crews. Some carvings suggest mythic stories, others speak of conflict and journeys. The art forms a visual language that still resists full interpretation. Across Europe, the Bronze Age unfolded in the shadow of great civilizations of the Aegean and Near East. Copper and tin were unevenly distributed, forcing communities into vast trade networks. Amber and furs moved south, while finished metal goods moved north. These connections created new elites, who displayed their status through weapons and ornaments. The sword became the emblem of the warrior, designed purely for combat and often bearing scars of use. Yet skeletons rarely show clear signs of battle injuries, leaving the reality of warfare uncertain. A dramatic exception appeared in the Tollens Valley of northern Germany. Along a quiet river, archaeologists uncovered the remains of more than 100 people dated to around 1200 BC. Many skulls bore lethal blows, and a flint arrowhead still lodged in a shoulder bone. Weapons, horse gear, and broken equipment lay scattered through the water. The site suggests a large clash, perhaps the earliest known battlefield in northern Europe, revealing a violent side of the age that monuments alone could not show. Metalworking itself was a specialized craft. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, required knowledge of smelting, casting, and finishing. The shining material allowed the creation of axes, shields, and trumpets of breathtaking form. In Scandinavia, most objects were cast rather than hammered, and workshops across the south produced tools from imported ingots. The arrival of horses, chariots, and new textiles further changed society, while competition for resources encouraged both alliance and conflict. For a long time, settlements from this period were almost invisible, erased by later ploughing. Modern excavations have revealed that the typical unit was the single farm with a longhouse and small outbuildings. Houses were lighter than earlier ones, built with rows of interior posts and walls of woven branches coated with clay. The landscape had become open pasture as forests retreated. Some farms grew into local centres, with large halls belonging to chieftains. One such hall at Bjerre in northern Denmark lay preserved beneath drifting sand. Inside, archaeologists found hearths, tools, pieces of amber and traces of cattle, barley, and wheat. The amber, gathered from nearby beaches, was likely destined for exchange far beyond the region. These communities left their mark not only in houses but in fields laid out as small irregular plots between marshy hollows. Cattle dominated the economy, and the rhythm of herding shaped daily life. Although villages were rare, clusters of farms sometimes surrounded a powerful household, hinting at early chiefdoms. Fortified settlements were unusual in Scandinavia, yet evidence of social hierarchy appears clearly in the great burial mounds that still rise across Denmark and Sweden. Within those barrows lay oak coffins filled with finely dressed men and women, accompanied by swords, razors, combs, and ornaments. Later generations practiced cremation, placing ashes in urns but still building impressive monuments. The contrast between rich graves and ordinary settlements shows how unequal society had become. Control of amber and access to metal created leaders whose authority reached across wide territories. In the high interior of Western Norway, where deep fjords meet steep mountains, archaeologists once undertook a survey that reshaped ideas about life in the Nordic Bronze Age. The investigation stretched from the salt-washed shoreline to wind-swept plateaus more than 1,000 meters above the sea, well beyond the line where trees can grow. Across this rugged landscape, they discovered a string of seasonal camps and activity areas, places that had briefly sheltered people who moved between coast and upland. Most of the sites were modest, marked only by scattered tools, yet one was enormous. A spread of stone debris covering 2,000 square meters and containing more than 200,000 worked fragments. Among the stones lay traces of pottery, strengthened with asbestos fibers. A few scraps of bronze, a piece of a soapstone vessel, and even a small crucible that had once held molten copper. The setting itself explained much about these places. Winters in the Norwegian highlands are long and severe, and deep snow makes permanent settlement almost impossible. The camps were therefore used only in the warmer months, when hunters followed reindeer onto the open plateaus. The great number of arrow and spear points showed how important the chase remained, even in an age when farming was spreading elsewhere in Scandinavia. Reindeer was virtually the only large animal in these uplands, and bones of sheep and goats hinted that some families may have driven their herds upward each summer, practicing an early form of seasonal herding that would continue in Norway for thousands of years. One shelter, beneath a cliff known as Skrivarhelleren, revealed an even longer story. Layers of soil inside the rock overhang contain material from the late Neolithic, through the dawn of the Iron Age. Objects linked the site to the wider world of southern Scandinavia. A soapstone mould used for casting bronze, fragments of slag from metalworking, and pieces of finely made flint daggers. The animal bones told of varied meals: reindeer, hares, birds, and most surprising of all, seal. Remains of herring, salmon, cod, and shellfish showed that the people who camped so high above the valleys regularly travelled the 12 kilometres to the fjord to fish and gather marine food. The mountains and the sea were part of the same seasonal rhythm. From these clues, a picture emerged of coastal farmers who treated the interior as a summer extension of their homeland. They grazed animals on rich upland pastures, hunted in the open country, and fished the rivers and the fjord before returning to sheltered villages when autumn storms began. This flexible use of contrasting environments became a lasting feature of Norwegian life, surviving into the modern age. Far to the east, in the Swedish heartland near Lake Fetton, another site offered a very different glimpse of the late Bronze Age. On a low hill, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a fortified farmstead known as Vistad, dated roughly between 900 and 500 years before the Common Era. The settlement was extraordinary. At least 5 houses stood within a circular wooden palisade almost 140 metres across. The ditch that held the posts was nearly a metre deep, and the barrier itself may have risen 5 metres high, strengthened with stones packed around its base. Traces of a second internal fence suggested that the space inside was divided into separate zones, perhaps for families, workshops, or animals. The houses at Vistad did not resemble the typical long dwellings of Scandinavia. They were small, square or rectangular buildings whose walls, rather than central roof posts, carried the weight of the structure. The construction seems to have used horizontal timbers, more like log houses than the familiar 3-aisled halls. Around them lay hearths, cooking pits, storage holes, and refuse dumps filled with the bones of sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and dogs, along with ducks, geese, beavers, and many kinds of fish. 4 domed ovens, unlike anything known elsewhere in Sweden, were discovered inside the settlement, and within them were traces of iron slag, hinting at early experimentation with a new metal. The pottery was perhaps the most remarkable find. Careful study showed that much of it had been made far to the south in Central Europe, in the region associated with the Lusatian culture. The shapes of the vessels, the fortified layout of the farm, and even the style of the houses all echoed that distant world. Some scholars came to believe that Vistad may have been an outpost used by foreign prospectors and smiths who travelled north in search of iron and other resources. Whether the place was a colony, a trading station, or simply a community inspired by southern fashions, it testified to powerful connections across the Baltic during the first millennium before the Common Era. Across Scandinavia, another mystery accompanied these exchanges: the habit of burying valuable objects in bogs, streams, and lonely wetlands. Over the last decades, the use of metal detectors has revealed around 1,000 such hoards. Their contents vary wildly: ceremonial axes, bronze shields, great curved trumpets, drinking vessels, horse gear, even the famous sun chariot from a Danish marsh. Some deposits look like the equipment of a single person, a warrior's weapons or a woman's jewellery. Other objects appear only in hoards and never in graves, suggesting that they were made specifically for ritual. Many of the pieces were too fragile for practical use. Battle axes were sometimes thin shells of bronze wrapped around clay cores, and the shields were sheets of metal no thicker than a knife blade. Yet some shields carried scars consistent with combat, and the debate over their true purpose continues. A few hoards clearly belong to craftsmen, containing broken tools and lumps of raw bronze, hidden for future work. The rhythm of these offerings changed over time, rising and falling with the flow of metal from Central Europe. In the early phases, wealthy men and women were buried in impressive barrows, with rich grave goods. Later, when such burials became rare, enormous quantities of bronze were instead consigned to the marshes. These objects represented more than material wealth. They were symbols of rank and power, and perhaps gifts to supernatural forces, believed to govern harvests, journeys, and war. Feasting must have accompanied many of these ceremonies. Bowls, cups, and ladles found in deposits and graves speak of beer, wine, or mead shared among elites. The close of a great gathering may have been marked by the burial of precious items, a dramatic act that removed wealth from circulation while proclaiming the generosity of the giver. In some cases, animals, and perhaps humans, were sacrificed, linking ritual, politics, and the economy in a single spectacle. The landscape of the Bronze Age was also shaped by the dead. Tens of thousands of earthen barrows once rose across Denmark and southern Sweden. Each mound required the stripping of fertile turf from surrounding fields, a costly gesture that proclaimed the importance of the person beneath. The best preserved burials used hollow oak coffins placed inside carefully engineered cores that were flooded with water before being sealed, creating conditions that preserved textiles, wood, and even skin for more than 3 millennia. Most of these remarkable graves were built within a short span around the 14th century, before the Common Era. Because tree ring dating can identify the exact year an oak was felled, it is clear that many of the individuals buried in different mounds were contemporaries who might have known one another. The goods placed with them, swords, razors, brooches, and golden ornaments, reveal a society sharply divided by status. Some graves glittered with metal, others contained none at all. Barrows were not placed at random. They clustered on productive farmland and often formed lines along ancient routes, marking the paths of movement across the countryside. Beneath many mounds, archaeologists have found the traces of earlier houses, showing that people chose to bury their leaders on ground already tied to family and memory. The connection between ancestors and land was made visible in earth and stone. A striking contrast to these honoured burials appeared near Trondheim in Norway, where a mass of bones was discovered just below the soil. More than 20 men, women, and children had been thrown together without ceremony. Many skulls showed deep sword cuts, some healed, others fresh. The victims suffered from malnutrition and heavy labour, their teeth worn by gritty food. Nearby, under stone cairns, lay the graves of better-fed individuals accompanied by bronze weapons. The two sites suggested a harsh world in which violence and inequality were everyday realities. Elsewhere in Denmark, the great mound of Diverhøj illustrated how such monuments were built in stages. Beneath the final barrow lay earlier structures, a smaller mound, a stone cairn, and the remains of a Neolithic village. Inside, a hollow oak coffin rested a man with a magnificent decorated axe, brooches on his chest, and tools for making fire at his side. The labour needed to strip hectares of turf, for the mound showed how much power his family must have commanded. In Sweden, the Hågar mound near Uppsala contained one of the richest cremation graves known. Gold-covered ornaments, a sword and personal tools accompanied the ashes of a small man, perhaps a regional chieftain. Nearby stood the foundations of ritual houses where ceremonies for the dead were likely performed, linking community, belief, and authority in a single sacred landscape. Throughout the later Bronze Age, new forms of burial appeared. Stone outlines shaped like ships were built beneath mounds, echoing the importance of seafaring in both daily life and religious imagination. Cremation became common, and urns were placed within these symbolic vessels. The ship carried the sun across the sky and the soul toward the other world, a powerful image repeated on rock carvings, razors, and miniature models. In the mid-1980s, construction of a natural gas pipeline across northern Sjælland in Denmark opened a rare window onto the ritual life of the late Bronze Age. As heavy machines stripped away the topsoil along the planned route, archaeologists walked the exposed ground, searching for traces of the past before the landscape was altered forever. In a region already famous for its dense scatter of ancient tombs and megaliths, they noticed patches of dark earth and charcoal at a place called Zandegård. Careful excavation soon revealed the outline of a building unlike any ordinary house. The structure stood alone in an open field, with only a distant settlement several hundred meters to the north. It was marked by two parallel rows of large, rounded stones, set about 70 centimeters apart, forming a long, rectangular enclosure. The outer dimensions stretched nearly 19 meters by 7.5, while the inner space was narrower, more intimate. No clear post holes survived, and the original roof and walls had vanished, leaving the stones as the only enduring skeleton. On the eastern side, several blocks were missing, perhaps removed by centuries of ploughing, perhaps once marking an entrance whose form can no longer be known. Beneath the floor lay 3 cremation urns from the late Bronze Age, each carefully covered with a flat stone. Their presence suggested that the building had been raised to honour the dead, perhaps as a house where ancestors were remembered, or where rites were performed for newly departed members of the community. Everything about the interior differed from a normal dwelling. There were no flint tools, no heaps of domestic waste, none of the everyday debris that usually fills prehistoric homes. Instead, scattered across the floor were fragments of crucibles and moulds used for melting and casting bronze. The place seemed connected to metalworking, yet no hearths or furnaces were found. Whatever activities occurred here were unlike ordinary craft. Just outside the southern end of the enclosure, the excavators uncovered features that deepened the mystery. A tall pointed stone, nearly 2 meters long, had once stood upright in a carefully shaped socket. Nearby lay the broken pieces of a second stone of the same kind. These monoliths must have guarded the approach to the building like silent sentinels. Between them were discovered 4 flat slabs engraved with the image of an open hand, above which ran 4 parallel lines. The motif was repeated almost identically on each stone. Similar carved hands are known from other parts of Scandinavia, often near graves, but their meaning remains elusive. They may have marked a boundary that ordinary people were forbidden to cross, or they may have symbolized a gesture toward the realm of the dead, a sign meant to keep spirits in their proper place. Such ritual buildings were part of a wider landscape of ceremony that reached its most dramatic expression in the great burial mounds of Denmark. Around 800 years before the Common Era, on the island of Fyn, a monumental barrow known today as Lusehoy rose above the fields. When completed, it measured 36 meters across and 8 meters high, visible for kilometers in every direction. Yet the mound was only the final chapter in a long sequence of events. Beneath it lay the traces of an older settlement, later turned into cultivated fields, and then into a small cemetery of modest graves. Only after these earlier memories had faded did the builders raise the massive hill that dominates the site today. The first tomb inside the mound was a stone chamber prepared for a powerful man. His body had been burned, and the ashes were placed inside a finely made bronze vessel, a type usually used for drinking at feasts. The urn and its contents were wrapped in a delicate cloth woven from nettle fibres. With him were buried a gold arm ring, 2 razors, and toggle buttons of gold and bronze. The lid of the vessel was sealed with resin that still preserved the impressions of amber once pressed into its surface. The entire package was bound with cord, wrapped in wool and oxhide, and finally covered with a heavy layer of stones. Not long afterward, a second leader was honoured at the same place. 6 large posts were set into the ground, perhaps forming a platform on which his body was displayed before the funeral. Evidence of a wagon suggests that the corpse and his belongings were brought in procession. The structure was then burned, and the charred remains gathered into a deep pit. Around the grave, a wicker fence was erected, and only then was the enormous mound heaped above the 2 chiefs. Thousands of cubic meters of turf were stripped from more than 7 hectares of land, a task that would have required the labour of an entire community for many months. The personal equipment of the second man was badly damaged by the fire. Fragments of a sword, pieces of a bronze container, chains and rattles of tin, hundreds of small rivets from a leather belt, and traces of gold whose original form could no longer be recognised. Even in destruction, these objects spoke of wealth and wide connections. Recent studies have suggested that the nettle cloth of the first burial may have been woven in the Alpine region, and the bronze vessel itself likely originated there as well. The journey of the dead and their possessions across such distances reveals how far the networks of the Nordic Bronze Age reached. Another remarkable set of burials lay beneath the mound of Borum Eshoy near modern Aarhus. This giant barrow, once 9 meters high, covered 3 oak coffins containing an older man and woman and a young man who was probably their son. Tree ring dates show that 2 of the coffins were made around the middle of the 14th century, before the Common Era, implying that the family died within a short span of years. The preservation was astonishing. When the mound was opened in the 19th century, hair, skin, and clothing were still intact. The elder man lay wrapped in a cowhide and woolen blanket, dressed in a dome-shaped cap, a short kilt, and a cloak fastened with a wooden pin. His hands were well kept, his face clean-shaven, suggesting a life not entirely devoted to heavy labour. The woman beside him had worked harder. The muscles marked on her bones told of years of physical effort. She wore a long skirt and blouse, a tasselled belt, and a hairnet that still held her dark hair. Rings of bronze and gold adorned her arms and neck, and a comb lay near her head. The young man was equally well preserved, clothed in shirt and kilt, with a bronze dagger in a wooden sheath and a horn comb at his side. These burials demonstrate how carefully appearance and identity were staged in death. Weapons, razors, tweezers, and fine textiles marked the social role of men, while women were distinguished by belts, pins, and elaborate hairstyles. The enormous effort invested in the mounds proclaimed the rank of those beneath them and reinforced the authority of the families who raised the monuments. A similar concern with display surrounded the burial of a teenage girl at Egtved in southern Denmark. She died around 1370 before the Common Era and was laid in a hollow oak trunk beneath a broad mound. Although her bones decayed, her clothing survived almost untouched. A short woolen top and a famous corded skirt that must have shimmered with bronze ornaments when she moved. At her waist hung a large decorated belt plate and a horn comb. A small bark bucket at her feet contained the remains of a fermented drink, perhaps used in the funeral rites. Beside her rested the cremated bones of a young child, hinting at a personal tragedy now beyond recovery. Not far from the Egtved region, at Skristrup, another young woman was buried with equal care. She wore a long woolen skirt, an embroidered blouse, and a bonnet, her hair arranged in an intricate net. Golden spiral rings by her ears signalled high status. Close to her mound, archaeologists uncovered one of the largest houses known from prehistoric Denmark, 50 metres long and divided into several rooms. Storage pits, a loom weight, and stalls for animals showed that this was the centre of a prosperous estate. The girl from the barrow may have lived within those walls during her brief life. Stone cairns rather than earthen mounds dominated the island of Gotland. The greatest of them, Ugorderøya, still rises like a hill of boulders near the Baltic shore. Although never excavated, its sheer size suggests a burial of exceptional importance. Farther south, in Scania, stands the cairn of Bredarø, enclosing a stone chamber decorated with carved images of ships, musicians, birds, and a chariot drawn by horses. These scenes may depict the funeral procession itself, frozen in stone to guide the soul on its journey. At Sagaholm, in central Sweden, engraved sandstone slabs formed a ring around another mound, each carved with vessels and figures whose stories are lost. Such monuments reveal how deeply the symbolism of the ship and the sun had entered Nordic belief, linking the fate of the dead with the daily voyage of light across the sky. Beyond the core farming regions, the Bronze Age took different forms. In southern Norway, most metal finds cluster along the coast and the deep fjords, while the interior remained largely in the hands of hunters and herders. In the far north, communities relied on marine mammals and fish, trading furs and walrus ivory with the farmers to the south. Interaction with peoples of Finland and the eastern Baltic introduced new styles of pottery, tempered with asbestos and decorated with textile impressions. Rock art appeared along rivers and shorelines, its footprints and sun disks echoing ideas that had travelled from the south. Along the northern Swedish coast, thousands of stone cairns marked the presence of settled groups, though grave goods were few. Pollen records suggest that farmers attempted to clear patches of forest for barley and for leaf fodder to feed their animals. After about 400 years before the Common Era, however, many of these areas were abandoned, perhaps because the climate turned colder and less forgiving. Thus, the Nordic Bronze Age was not a single uniform culture, but a mosaic of lifeways. Coastal farmers, upland hunters, travelling smiths, and distant traders all played their part. Great mounds celebrated the power of chiefs, while isolated cult houses guarded secrets of belief. Objects moved across mountains and seas, carrying stories that can still be glimpsed in the soil. The people of that age lived between field and fjord, between fire and water, shaping a world that was at once practical and deeply symbolic, a world whose echoes remain scattered across the landscapes of Scandinavia today. The Bronze Age in Northern Europe often reveals itself through treasures. What remains from this distant era is rarely the everyday clutter of ordinary life, but instead the objects that people valued most, ceremonial pieces, finely crafted ornaments, and items buried with the dead or placed deliberately in the landscape. These discoveries open a window onto a world where craftsmanship, belief, and power were closely bound together. One of the most striking finds emerged from a Danish bog at Trundholm. There, in the early 20th century, a farmer's plough uncovered a small bronze sculpture unlike anything seen before. It showed a horse drawing a large gilded disc, an image that seems to capture the movement of the sun across the sky. The model was carefully made, resting on 6 wheels as if intended to travel. One side of the disc shone with gold, the other remained dark bronze, suggesting day and night. Whoever created it clearly imagined the sun not as a distant light, but as a living force pulled by a sacred animal. The object hints at a cosmology in which horses and ships guided the sun through the heavens and the underworld, carrying light from dawn to dusk. Sound also played a role in Bronze Age ritual. Long bronze horns, known today as lures, have been found in marshes across Denmark and southern Scandinavia. These instruments, shaped like elegant curves of metal, could produce deep, resonant tones similar to a trombone. Many were deposited in pairs as though placed in the water after ceremonial use. Rock carvings show figures holding such horns, suggesting processions and gatherings where music accompanied worship, perhaps in honour of the sun or ancestral spirits. Wealth and ritual merged again at Marisminde, on the island of Finn. There, a bronze vessel had been filled with 11 bowls of pure gold and buried in the earth. Each bowl was hammered from a single sheet and decorated with spirals and circles, while most carried delicate handles ending in the heads of horses. These were not ordinary cups, but symbols of status, likely used in feasts where leaders affirmed alliances and power through shared drink. Another extraordinary object came from a burial mound at Trudskøy, a bronze bowl set upon a small wheeled frame decorated with birds and dangling tin pendants that would have chimed when moved. The vessel must have carried an alcoholic drink during ceremonies, rolling through gatherings like a portable centre of celebration. Its design connected Scandinavia with Central Europe, revealing how ideas and prestige goods travelled great distances. Personal objects also carried meaning. A bronze razor from southern Denmark shows a ship pulling a golden circle, while a serpent coils above it. The scene echoes myths of cosmic journeys and nightly struggles between light and darkness. Even a tool used for shaving could express the owner's place within a sacred universe. Far to the north, at Alta in Norway, thousands of images were carved into rock faces over millennia. Hunters depicted reindeer, whales, birds, boats, and human figures dancing or fishing. These were not the works of farmers, but of communities living from the sea and forests. Their art speaks of shamanic rites, of respect for animals, and of journeys across water and spirit worlds. Across Scandinavia, the Bronze Age brought deep social change. Differences in wealth became more visible. Some graves held swords, gold rings, and fine clothing, while others contained little. Warfare grew common, and the figure of the warrior gained prestige. craft specialists emerged, producing metalwork, textiles, and elaborate ornaments. Personal appearance mattered. Razors, combs, and tweezers appear in elite burials, suggesting that identity was carefully maintained even in death. Power was not centralized in towns, but in networks of leaders, tied by gift exchange and travel. Chiefs strengthened authority through feasts, alliances, and displays of rare objects. Monumental burial mounds marked their dominance on the landscape. Yet toward the end of the Bronze Age, these traditions weakened. Supplies of bronze declined as trade routes shifted. Forests were overused, and iron began to replace older metals. The age of bronze faded, giving way to a new era. With iron came transformation. The early Iron Age in Scandinavia unfolded alongside the distant shadow of Rome. Though Roman legions never reached the far north, Roman goods did. Glass, weapons, and coins travelled through trade and diplomacy. Iron, unlike bronze, could be made from local ore, freeing communities from dependence on imported metals. Producing iron was laborious. Bog ore was gathered, roasted, and smelted in clay furnaces fueled by charcoal. The resulting bloom had to be hammered repeatedly before it became useful. Yet the effort was worthwhile. Iron tools were sharper and more durable, and iron weapons changed the balance of power. Life in the Iron Age centered on farms. Early on, households were scattered across the landscape, each consisting of a longhouse with living space and stables under one roof. Over time, villages formed, surrounded by fences that defined property and social order. Outbuildings served as workshops, granaries, and weaving huts sunk slightly into the ground. At places like Ginderup in northern Denmark, archaeology captured moments of disaster. One house burned so quickly that its contents remained where they fell. Pestles, hearths, storage bins, even a rope halter left beside the stalls. The charred seeds of barley and flax revealed what the family had planned to plant that year, while fragments of oak and hazel showed the vanished forest around them. Other sites reveal long histories of community. Hodder was a village enclosed by a wooden palisade, its houses arranged around a common space. The largest farm stood apart, hinting at a local leader. Vorbase, not far away, tells an even longer story. For more than 1,000 years, the settlement shifted across the fields, growing and shrinking with fortune and crisis. Houses became larger, stables held dozens of animals, and some graves displayed wealth from far beyond Denmark. Glass from the south, bronze vessels, finely made weapons. Yet the Iron Age was not only a time of growth. In the 6th century, many villages across Sweden and Denmark were abandoned. Tree rings record years of bitter cold, when the sun dimmed and harvests failed. Communities shrank and offerings of gold were placed in the earth, perhaps as desperate appeals to unseen powers. Despite hardship, centres of power emerged. Large estates controlled trade in iron and cattle, and leaders built halls where feasts bound followers to their rule. Across northern Europe, the identity of Germanic peoples took shape, defined by farming, warfare, and loyalty to chieftains. Roman writers described them as hardy, proud, and bound to the hunt and the sword. On the Danish island of Finn, a place called Gudme rose to prominence as one of Scandinavia's earliest major centres of exchange during the centuries when the Roman world still shaped distant trade routes. The name itself can be translated as home of the gods, and the landscape around it reinforces that sense of sacred importance. 3 nearby hills carry striking titles that speak to ritual and reverence: Sacrifice Hill, Holy Hill, and the Hill of the Gods. From roughly the 3rd century to about the 6th, Gudme thrived at a scale unusual for the region, and although activity later diminished, people continued to live in the area long after its peak, even into the late Viking Age. What makes Gudme stand out is not only wealth, but the way political authority, religious meaning, and long-distance commerce seem to have gathered together in one place. Some scholars have proposed that large elite centres, in later Iron Age Scandinavia, were not laid out randomly, but shaped by ideas about the cosmos and the divine order. The fullest written descriptions of Norse myth come from much later medieval storytelling. Yet the beliefs behind those stories likely drew on older traditions. In that mythic geography, the gods dwell in a great realm ruled by Odin, a place defined by grand halls, fallen warriors gathered for the afterlife, and an atmosphere of skilled craftwork. When that imaginative picture is compared with certain high-status settlements, Gudme often enters the conversation alongside other key sites in Sweden, suggesting that powerful communities may have tried to mirror sacred ideals in the real world, turning landscapes into statements of authority and holiness. Gudme appears to be the earliest and, in several ways, the most expansive of these central places. It grew into a broad settlement zone integrated with nearby components that completed its function. A coastal landing and trading station lay a short distance away at Lundeborg, linking the inland settlement to sea traffic across the Baltic. Not far from Gudme, a vast cemetery served as the main resting place for local communities across generations. Taken together, settlement, port, and burial ground formed a connected system that supported both daily life and elite power. At its height, the settlement at Gudme spread across an area close to a square kilometre. Instead of a tight town plan, it consisted of many smaller farms separated by fences, scattered across a wet landscape where dry ground was precious. People built on the higher patches, leaving the lower zones as marsh and waterlogged ground. At the centre stood the estate of a magnate, an elite household whose influence extended outward over surrounding farms. Many of these dependent farms were not simply producing food. They were workshops as well, especially for metalworking, suggesting that manufacturing was not independent in the way later urban crafts might be. Production and exchange appear closely tied to the authority of the ruling household, with elite power shaping who made goods, who moved them, and who benefited from the flow of wealth. The finds from Gudme make that wealth hard to ignore. Thousands of metal objects have been recovered, including several hoards of gold and silver from the late 4th through the 6th centuries. In total, more than 10 kilograms of gold have been found across the Gudme area, and at least one hoard contained over 4 kilograms on its own. Such concentrations suggest more than personal adornment or casual savings. They point to a place where precious metal circulated in large quantities, collected, divided, tested, and stored. Some deposits include the kinds of fragments and droplets that look like the remains of working gold rather than finished display pieces, hinting at expert craft production under elite control. Gudme also stands out for the sheer variety of imported and unusual materials. Objects and fragments trace connections reaching across much of Central and Eastern Europe and even beyond into regions far to the southeast. Roman coins appear among the finds, alongside pieces of high-status equipment and luxury tableware from later imperial traditions, as well as finely made items linked to Western European workshops. Yet many of these objects did not arrive as pristine treasures. A large portion of the metal was deliberately cut, broken, or reduced into fragments, the kind of scrap meant to be melted and recast. Even a piece from a small Roman statue, a bronze fragment that once formed part of a heel, likely entered the site as material to be reused, rather than as a sacred artwork to be displayed. That detail matters, because it suggests Gudme was not merely receiving exotic objects as trophies. It was participating in a system where valuable materials were treated as resources, transformed and repurposed within a local economy shaped by elite demand. At the heart of the magnate estate stood a hall of extraordinary size for its time. The main building covered roughly 500 square metres of floor space, with another large hall nearby, about half that size. The principal hall stretched close to 50 metres long and around 10 metres wide, supported by massive roof posts, thick enough to suggest an imposing structure, possibly rising higher than a simple one-storey building. Its walls were formed from broad vertical planks, and large doors opened on both long sides, giving it a monumental presence. Built in the later 3rd century, it remained in use for about a century, and the broader complex was rebuilt repeatedly over a span of 200 to 300 years, with large structures rising again and again near the same locations. That repeated rebuilding reads like continuity of power, the kind of generational project that keeps a sacred and political centre alive even as styles and circumstances change. Inside the Great Hall, the evidence is not dominated by everyday cooking or heavy industrial work. Instead, the finds lean toward the valuable and the symbolic. Hacked silver, fine bronze and glass, ornate neck rings, small silver figures, and dozens of Roman silver coins. Around the main buildings were places where offerings appear to have been deposited, suggesting ritual practices linked directly to the elite residents. In such a setting, wealth is not only a sign of commerce, it becomes a tool of authority and a language of devotion, used to bind followers, impress visitors, and maintain the sense that this landscape belonged to powers greater than ordinary households. Nearby, the cemetery at Mullagårdsmarken adds another dimension to the story. It is among the largest known prehistoric graveyards in Scandinavia, with around 2,300 graves, dating mainly from the 1st centuries of the Common Era into the 4th. Most burials were cremations. Many were richly furnished, and the cemetery is famous for the number of imported Roman objects found there. Yet one detail stands out as puzzling. Despite the richness of many graves, weapons are absent. In a world where weapons often signal status, identity, and the values of warrior culture, this absence invites interpretation. It may reflect local choices about how power and identity were expressed in death, or it may point to social rules about what could be buried, what had to remain with the living, or what belonged to ritual contexts elsewhere. The coastal trading station at Lundeborg reveals how Gudme connected to the sea. The site stretches along the shoreline and contains extensive traces of craft activity, particularly metalworking, woodworking, and the production of items from amber, antler, horn, and bone. The scale of iron rivets found there suggests shipbuilding and repair were important as well. Many of the exotic goods at the port are Roman in origin, including glass beads and fragments of glass vessels, along with a distinctive fine red pottery with a glossy finish. Much of this material is broken into fragments, the kind of debris that might accumulate from transport losses, discarded cargo, or goods damaged during shipping and handling. Small hut floors appear rather than large permanent buildings, which fits the image of a seasonal market zone, active during favourable months when travel and exchange were easiest. In this period, coin-based commerce had not yet become the dominant economic system across Scandinavia. Exchange relied largely on barter, and a barter market demanded clear visibility, open space, and the presence of authority to prevent fraud and violence. A beach where ships landed offered exactly that environment, with room for negotiation and immediate access to incoming cargo. But such markets also required enforcement, and that need for control helps explain why trade places often sit under the shadow of elite power. At Gudme, political influence, Religious prestige and commercial advantage seem to converge, reinforcing one another rather than competing. At a quiet lake called Illerup in eastern Denmark, archaeologists uncovered traces of one of the largest military catastrophes of the Northern Iron Age. Unlike single dramatic discoveries, Illerup represents a sequence of ceremonies spread across centuries. Each episode followed the same grim pattern. An invading force was defeated. Its weapons and personal gear were gathered from the battlefield, deliberately damaged and cast into the water as an offering. By studying one major deposit dated around the year 200, researchers have estimated that the defeated army may have numbered close to 1,000 men. Such a force could not have been assembled casually. It implies powerful leaders capable of organizing transport, food supplies, and long journeys across sea and land. The objects from Illerup were not simply thrown away. Spears were snapped, swords twisted, shields smashed. Bundles of equipment were lowered from boats or hurled from the shore, accompanied by the slaughter of cattle and horses. The human fate of the losing warriors remains uncertain. Very few bodies were found with the weapons, suggesting that the killing or execution of prisoners happened elsewhere, perhaps in another sacred landscape. The character of the gear, especially details of style and manufacture, points toward Norway as the homeland of this ill-fated army. If that interpretation is correct, men had travelled hundreds of kilometres to fight in Danish territory, carrying with them the hopes and ambitions of distant chiefs. The scale of such campaigns forces difficult questions. What prize justified the risk? Control of trade routes, fertile land, prestige, or vengeance for earlier defeats may all have played a part. Whatever the motives, Illerup shows that Iron Age Scandinavia was capable of conflicts on a level once associated only with the classical world to the south. A second dramatic window into this violent era lies in the Nydam bog near the modern German border. In antiquity, it was a small lake, later choked with vegetation until it became marshland. During the 19th century, excavators uncovered an astonishing collection. Hundreds of weapons, tools, fragments of clothing, and 3 boats. 2 of the vessels were still largely intact, one made of oak and another of pine, while a third had been deliberately destroyed before being sunk. The discovery of complete ships far from the open sea startled everyone involved. The inventory of objects reads like the equipment of entire armies. Swords, spears, shields, bows, axes and knives lay beside personal items, such as brooches and belt fittings. Every piece had been ritually killed. Wooden shafts were broken, arrowheads bent, and the precious swords heated until they could be twisted like rope. The boats suffered the same fate, their hulls hacked open so they would sink. These actions were not acts of random vandalism, but formal gestures of gratitude to the gods, a way of removing the enemy's power from the world of the living. The oak vessel from Nydam, the only one to survive, is the oldest known example of the clinker-built tradition that later produced Viking longships. Stretching more than 20 metres, it was propelled by 15 pairs of oars and constructed from single, exceptionally long planks. Such trees are rare today, a reminder of how different the ancient forests must have been. Experiments with modern replicas have shown that the design handled rough seas with ease and could cover impressive distances in a single day. Renewed investigations in recent decades revealed that the site contained not one, but several separate offerings. The oldest belonged to the early 3rd century, while later deposits stretched into the 5th. Traces of pine in one boat suggested a Baltic origin, possibly from eastern Sweden or the island of Gotland. Oak used in other vessels must also have been imported, since suitable trees did not grow locally at the time. These clues hint at armies drawn from many regions, converging on southern Denmark through alliances or rivalries now lost to memory. The weapons themselves allow a glimpse of military organisation. Some belong to common infantry, simple spears, shields, and practical swords. Others were decorated with silver and gold, clearly the property of commanders. Spurs, bridles, and saddles reveal the presence of small cavalry units, while longbows and hundreds of arrow shafts point to skilled archers. The mix suggests armies structured in layers, from elites to support troops responsible for transport and maintenance. Among the most haunting items are objects from the final great deposit at Nydam in the late 5th century. Dozens of swords were driven into the peat in a circle, their blades slashed and ruined. One lance bore a tiny wolf figure inlaid with gold, while other fittings displayed intricate animal motifs. These were not anonymous tools of war, but possessions charged with identity and status, now surrendered to the marsh. The bog at Vimos on the island of Funen tells a similar story. Although only a small portion of the wetland was ever examined, more than 4,000 artifacts emerged. Bundles of weapons had been tied together with cords and dumped into the mire. Complete bows, iron mail shirts containing tens of thousands of rings, gaming pieces, combs, and even cooking gear lay among the wreckage. The presence of axes, hammers, drills, and other tools shows that armies travelled with craftsmen able to repair equipment on campaign. Warfare required an entire moving community, not merely fighters. Vimos also yielded some of the earliest known runic inscriptions. A simple word carved on a bone comb, probably a personal name, stands as one of the first voices of the Germanic languages. Such marks remind us that behind the heaps of broken metal were individuals who spoke, joked, prayed, and feared like any other people. These northern conflicts did not exist in isolation. Many of the swords and ornaments found in Danish bogs were of Roman style, evidence that some warriors had served as mercenaries in imperial armies before returning home. Ideas, tactics, and symbols flowed back along with pay and plunder. The griffin head discovered at Vimos, likely torn from a Roman helmet, shows how deeply Mediterranean imagery had penetrated the far north. Fortified settlements reveal another response to this age of danger. At Pryorsløkka in Jutland, a small farming community surrounded itself with a ditch and palisade. The construction required the dismantling of existing houses, suggesting sudden alarm rather than careful planning. Farther east, on the island of Öland, the stone ring fort of Ekatorp grew through several phases, eventually enclosing dozens of buildings behind towering walls. Such places were both refugees and symbols of collective identity. While southern Scandinavia was dominated by farming chiefdoms, the northern regions followed a different path. Along the coasts and river valleys of Norway and Sweden, communities combined agriculture with hunting, fishing, and control of valuable resources such as iron ore and furs. The Great Hall at Borg in the Lofoten Islands, more than 80 meters long, shows that powerful leaders also rose in the Arctic zone. Trade in dried fish, whetstones, and exotic goods connected these remote areas with the political centers of the south. In the interior, mobile hunter groups, ancestors of today's Sami, maintained their own traditions. For centuries, they interacted with the farming societies, exchanging furs and other northern products for metal and grain. The relationship was complex, at times cooperative, at times tense, but it shaped the cultural map of Scandinavia long before the Viking Age. Amid the stories of war and settlement, the Iron Age also produced extraordinary works of art. The silver cauldron from Gundestrup, decorated with scenes of gods and warriors, reflects a blend of Celtic and northern imagination. The legendary golden horns of Galahus, covered with mysterious figures and runic words, once shone as symbols of prestige before their tragic destruction in the 19th century. Such treasures hint at the beliefs and ambitions of elites who ruled through spectacle as much as force. On the Danish island of Bornholm, one place keeps appearing in conversations about Iron Age power: Sort Muld. Much of what is known about it did not come from a single dramatic excavation, but from countless small signals pulled from the soil, especially from metal detector finds. Among those discoveries was a hoard that stood out immediately, not only because it was gold, but because of what the objects represented. The centerpiece of the find was a group of gold bracteates, a type of pendant strongly associated with elite society in Northern Europe during the late Iron Age. These bracteates were not large. Most were only a few centimeters across. Thin, round discs of gold fitted with a small loop so they could be hung from a cord or chain. Their size made them intimate objects, the kind of jewelry worn close to the body. Yet their meaning reached far beyond decoration. Bracteates carried images tied to sacred belief and political identity. They were statements in miniature: wealth pressed into gold and ideas pressed into symbols. Some show figures that can be recognized as gods from later Nordic tradition, including a powerful rider on an 8-legged horse, a scene often linked to Odin and Sleipnir. Finds like these suggest that a distinctly northern religious world was already taking shape by this time, and that belief was not separate from status. It was displayed, carried, and possibly invoked through precious metal. The origins of the gods depicted on these pendants remain uncertain. Northern Europe did not develop in isolation. For centuries, communities in southern Scandinavia had been in contact with the Roman world through trade, gift exchange, military service, and imitation. It is possible that certain divine roles and visual conventions were reshaped through this contact, even if the local stories and names became uniquely Scandinavian. Bracteates capture that tension perfectly, unmistakably local in style and symbolism, yet created in a world that had long been aware of Rome. One particular discovery at Sort Muld reveals how easily modern eyes can misread ancient objects. A metal detector signal led to what looked like a dull, tubular fragment, something closer to scrap metal than treasure. At first glance, it resembled a rolled piece of industrial debris, but careful examination revealed its true purpose. The tube was a sheet of silver that had been wrapped around a bundle of gold items like a protective sleeve. Inside it lay a compact collection: several bracteates, a set of Roman gold coins, cross-shaped wheel pendants, and fine beads made with delicate filigree work. It is easy to imagine these pieces once belonging together, perhaps strung as a single chain or necklace. The act of wrapping them in silver and hiding them suggests either an urgent attempt to protect valuable property during danger, or a deliberate placement as a sacred deposit. Either way, the hoard feels personal, like someone's portable fortune folded and sealed before being surrendered to the ground. Bornholm's gold points toward a wider pattern across Scandinavia. The richest objects tend to cluster at major gathering places. These were not ordinary farms. They were hubs where craft specialists worked, where prestige goods circulated, where alliances formed, and where belief could be expressed through material display. In that world, a pendant was not just a pendant. It was a sign of belonging and access, a visible claim to protection, legitimacy, and connection. Another discovery, far from Bornholm, shows how wealth could follow people into the grave with almost theatrical intensity. On the island of Funen, a burial found near Åslev contained 2 women laid side by side. The arrangement raised immediate questions even in early reports. Was one a companion, a servant, or someone bound by obligation to follow the other into death? Whatever the relationship, the burial was unmistakably elite. It contained a remarkable mix of objects, metal vessels, containers, small luxury items, and a jewellery set so elaborate it still reads like a catalogue of power. Among the most striking pieces were several nearly matching gold pendants, each built around a small disc, with a lion's face from which hung chains carrying a plate, set with garnets. The repetition suggests deliberate design, as if the jewellery was meant to present a coordinated image rather than a random collection. There were also exceptional brooches made with precious metal and coloured stones, and an ornate finger ring holding garnets alongside a large carnelian. A tubular pendant combined gold with dangling half-wheel shapes suspended from chains. Alongside these pieces lay a Roman gold coin adapted into a pendant form, linking the burial directly to the prestige economy of the wider world. One small object in the grave added another layer of meaning. A crystal sphere, rare enough on its own, but made even more unusual by the presence of an engraved inscription designed to read the same forwards and backwards. Such a design feels like more than ornament. It suggests a protective formula or sacred phrase, something meant to guard the owner in life or guide them in death. Objects like this blur the line between jewellery and ritual equipment. They also hint that belief and magic, whatever form they took, were woven into elite identity, carried as carefully as gold. The style of some items from this burial does not point only to Scandinavia. Certain design choices and materials resemble fashions from regions far to the southeast. That has led to the idea that at least one of the women may not have been born locally. Whether she arrived through marriage, political alliance, or forced movement, the possibility itself is revealing. It shows how far elite networks could reach, and how people as well as objects could travel across Europe long before the Viking Age made such movement famous. Wetlands, however, did not preserve only metal and treasure. In northern Germany, a bog at Brach produced a very different kind of discovery. Two human-shaped wooden figures carved from forked oak branches. One was taller than the other, a male and a female form, simplified into long, narrow bodies with exaggerated sexual features. The woman's hair was indicated by a bun, while the man's hair appeared as short bangs. These were not toys. Their scale alone suggests a public function, and their placement in a wetland hints at a sacred setting. They may have stood at the edge of marshy ground as representations of local spirits, or gods, watching over a place where offerings were made. Together, Bornholm's gold, Funen's grave, and Brach's wooden figures point toward a larger story. During the Iron Age, power in Scandinavia was becoming more concentrated, more organised, and more visible. In earlier times, daily life revolved around farms and small communities, and authority may have been spread across kin groups. Yet even then, signs of coordination appear. Defensive constructions and large-scale mobilization show that people could unite for war or communal projects. Over time, social difference became harder to miss. Some households grew larger and more enclosed. Certain graves became richer and more monumental. Imported prestige goods became markers of rank. Sacred activity also left a strong imprint on the landscape. People placed valuable objects in bogs and lakes, sacrificed animals, deposited food, and in some cases executed humans as offerings. These acts were not random. They were public gestures tied to belief, and they often involved the deliberate destruction of the objects being given away. A weapon bent or broken was not simply discarded, it was symbolically removed from human use and transferred to another realm. As the centuries passed, economic life, ritual authority, and political leadership began to overlap. Powerful individuals did not only control land and labour, they also managed exchange, gathered followers, and linked themselves to sacred practice. Rich burials filled with foreign luxury goods show that these elites were connected to the continent and participated in long-distance systems of prestige. Warfare, too, seems to have played a major role in strengthening such leadership. Large weapon deposits and evidence for sizable armies suggest conflict on a scale that required planning, alliances, and hierarchy. In these conditions, warriors increasingly resemble organized soldiers rather than isolated raiders. By the later part of the Iron Age, settlement patterns in parts of southern Scandinavia appear denser and more structured. Villages formed in a clearer sense, and social ranking became more formal. Differences between graves, both in construction and in the objects included, underline widening gaps between rich and poor. At the same time, certain places rose as major centres, sites where craft production, trade, feasting, ritual, and leadership converged. These hubs helped reduce regional differences in material culture, making southern Scandinavia look more integrated than before. Some scholars have interpreted that trend as the early formation of larger political units, perhaps even the beginnings of a Danish kingdom by the 6th century, with influence extending across nearby islands and into southern Sweden and parts of Norway. In the following centuries, a shift becomes visible in where wealth was displayed. Instead of placing luxury goods in graves or wetlands, elites increasingly kept them within high-status residences and estates. That change suggests new attitudes about inheritance and ownership, and possibly new rules about what could be surrendered to the dead. At the same time, trade networks grew stronger, early urban life began to take shape, and the worldview of the region changed. By the time the Viking Age approached, large halls and central estates dominated key landscapes, acting as political headquarters, ceremonial spaces, and economic engines. Names of peoples and rulers begin to appear in written records around this period, and major market towns and fortified boundaries emerge soon after, showing that earlier Iron Age consolidation was turning into something closer to state formation. Across Scandinavia, similar developments unfolded with local variations. Southern Sweden often moved in step with Denmark, while regions farther north and east followed their own trajectories, but still produced great halls, monumental mounds, and strong local rulers tied to trade in iron, furs, and other resources. The shared rhythm of change, rising elites, expanding networks, increasing integration, highlights how closely connected the upper levels of society had become across Northern Europe. Alongside politics and war, another transformation was taking place: the shaping of Nordic religion into recognizable forms. Gold pendants bearing divine images, small figurines, and ritual deposits suggest a belief system that was becoming coherent enough to be displayed in art and carried on the body. Some of these divine figures resemble roles familiar from the Roman world, suggesting that centuries of contact may have influenced how northern gods were imagined, even if the stories themselves remained distinctly local. Debate continues over how these ideas formed and what outside forces may have accelerated change. But the material evidence is clear on one point. By the late Iron Age, power in Scandinavia was no longer only about land and weapons. It was also about symbols, sacred authority, and the ability to turn belief into something people could see, wear, and follow.